Imagine walking into a city and finding it frozen mid-moment. Bowls still sitting where someone left them. Tools resting beside unfinished work. Rooms built with enough care and intention to last centuries, just standing there, empty. No signs of fire. No evidence of a massive battle that wiped everyone out. Just silence where thousands of people used to be. That image isn't fiction. It's what archaeologists found when they began seriously excavating the ancient canyon settlements of the American Southwest. Cities that once held populations in the thousands, some of the most sophisticated urban centres anywhere in North America at the time, abandoned. And not slowly, not over centuries of gradual thinning. Within a single generation, around 1300 AD, the people were gone. That's the mystery we're going to dig into today, and it's one of the genuinely strange ones. Not strange because the evidence is thin. Strange because the evidence is rich and detailed, and it still doesn't give us a clean answer. We have the buildings, we have the pottery, we have the tree rings, the pollen samples, the human remains, the trade goods, the ceremonial objects. We have more physical evidence from these people than we have from entire civilizations that collapsed elsewhere in the world at the same time. And yet the central question, why an entire people would deliberately walk away from cities they had spent generations building. Cities carved into cliff faces and stacked 5 stories high. Cities that required extraordinary coordination and labour to construct. That question has never been fully settled. Here's what makes it so compelling. This wasn't a small outpost community. This wasn't a handful of families living in a remote valley. The ancestral Pueblo people, which is what we call them today, had built something real. Dense, organised, architecturally complex urban centres in places like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde. Populations that traded goods across hundreds of miles. Communities with roads, astronomy, ceremony, and political structure. And then, within the span of a lifetime, those centres emptied out. If you're listening to this right now as you're falling asleep or driving or sitting somewhere quiet, tell me where you are and what time it is. Drop it in the comments. I genuinely look at those. There's something remarkable about knowing that someone in New Zealand and someone in Iceland and someone in Brazil might all be hearing this at completely different hours of the day. It mirrors the kind of thing we're talking about here, how human beings spread themselves across geography and carry meaning with them. So let me know where you are. Now, back to 1300 AD. The abandonment wasn't invisible. There are no ancient texts telling us what happened because the ancestral Pueblo people didn't use written language in the way we think of it. But they left behind a record anyway, encoded in wood and bone and earth and stone. Archaeologists have spent over a century learning how to read it, and what they've pieced together is a picture that's complicated in exactly the way real history always is. Not one cause, not one moment, not one decision made by one leader on one afternoon. Something more layered than that, and in some ways more troubling. What we can say with confidence and what remains fiercely debated are 2 very different lists. We can say when the major centres were occupied and when they weren't. We can say roughly how many people were living there. We can trace climate patterns with remarkable precision thanks to tree ring data. We can identify signs of violence, malnutrition, social stress. What we cannot do is climb inside the minds of the people who made the choice to leave. We cannot know what the final conversation sounded like. We cannot know whether it felt like escape or defeat or something else entirely, maybe something closer to a deliberate beginning. That tension is what makes this story worth exploring carefully. Because the easy version, the version where an entire civilization mysteriously vanishes overnight, is both seductive and wrong. The real version is harder to summarize but far more interesting. It involves drought and deforestation and violence and belief, and trade and identity, and the deeply human capacity to look at a place that's failing and decide to try somewhere else. So let's start at the beginning. Let's meet the people who built these cities, understand what they were building and why, and then trace exactly what went wrong. The people we're talking about didn't call themselves the ancestral Pueblo. They didn't leave us a name for themselves in any language we can read. The label we use today, Ancestral Pueblo, is actually a relatively recent correction. For most of the 20th century, archaeologists used a different term, Anasazi. borrowed from a Navajo word that translates roughly as ancient enemies or ancient ones who are not us. The problem with that label is layered. It applies a name from one native nation to the ancestors of different native nations. It carries connotations that those descendant communities find disrespectful, and it creates a false sense of distance, as if these were some vanished alien civilization rather than the direct ancestors of people who are alive today, people who have their own names for their own history. Ancestral Pueblo is the preferred term now, used by archaeologists and, more importantly, by the Pueblo communities of the American Southwest, who recognize these builders as their own grandmothers and grandfathers. That matters. It shapes how we ask questions about the abandonment. You ask different questions about a mystery when you understand that the people involved aren't gone, just relocated. So who were they? The ancestral Pueblo people were not a single tribe or a single political unit. Think of them more like a broad cultural family, communities across a large region who shared architectural traditions, pottery styles, ceremonial practices and trade relationships, but who organized themselves locally through clans and kin networks, rather than through any centralized authority. A clan might trace its identity through a shared ancestor, a particular animal, a sacred story. That clan membership determined who you married, which ceremonies you participated in, what responsibilities you carried in the community. These weren't abstract categories, they were the operating system of daily life. Those kin networks also stretched outward. A person in one canyon might have cousins in a settlement 3 days' walk away. Obligations ran along those lines: gifts, marriages, labor during construction or harvest, refuge when things went badly at home. The social world of the ancestral Pueblo was denser and more interconnected than the raw geography would suggest, and the geography was demanding. This is the American Southwest, the Colorado Plateau and its surrounding regions. What you get there is stark and beautiful and brutally unforgiving. Mesas that rise hundreds of feet above canyon floors, sandstone cliffs carved by wind and water into shapes that seem almost intentional, rivers that run full in spring and nearly dry by late summer, rainfall that comes in short, violent bursts, mostly in summer, and then disappears for stretches that can last years. The average annual precipitation across much of this landscape hovers somewhere between 8 and 14 inches. That's not much. Modern Phoenix uses more water in a summer afternoon than some of these communities could reasonably expect from the sky in an entire year. Settlement choices in this environment weren't casual. Where you built mattered enormously. You needed to be close enough to water sources to survive, but high enough to avoid flash floods. You needed soil that could hold moisture long enough for crops to grow, primarily corn, the caloric foundation of the whole culture. You needed access to timber for building and fuel, which meant the forests on higher ground. Every settlement represented a calculation, a bet placed on this particular combination of factors at this particular location. Some of those bets paid off for centuries, others failed within a generation. The major regions you need to know are roughly 4. Chaco Canyon, in what is now northwestern New Mexico, which by around 1000 to 1150 AD had become something like the gravitational center of a vast regional network, with great houses that housed hundreds and roads that stretched for miles in straight lines across the desert. Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado, where communities eventually moved their homes into the cliffs themselves, tucking entire villages into alcoves in the canyon walls. The Kayenta region of northeastern Arizona, a slightly more dispersed landscape of smaller communities connected by shared traditions. And the Rio Grande corridor further east, which would eventually become the destination. These regions weren't isolated from each other. They traded turquoise and pottery and shell and ideas. They shared architectural techniques. They watched each other. What happened in one region sent ripples through the others. And in the century leading up to 1300, something was going wrong across all of them at once. Not overnight. Not all at once. But the pressure was building, and the places that had been home for generations were beginning to fail in ways that couldn't be ignored. To understand why the abandonment is so striking, you have to understand what was being abandoned, and that requires spending a moment actually looking at what these people built. Start with the cliff dwellings themselves. The image most people carry in their heads buildings tucked into the hollows of canyon walls, is accurate but undersells the scale. These weren't shelters in the way a lean-to or a cave is a shelter. They were engineered structures, multi-story complexes with dozens or hundreds of rooms, built into alcoves formed by the natural erosion of sandstone. The rock overhead served as roof. The cliff face behind served as back wall. Everything else, the room dividers, the floors, the interior walls, the towers, was constructed by human hands from stone and mortar and timber, hauled from forests sometimes miles away. Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde is the most famous example, and for good reason. It contains roughly 150 rooms and around 23 kivas, the circular subterranean chambers that functioned as ceremonial spaces and possibly as social hubs for specific clan groups. At its height, it may have housed somewhere between 100 and 150 people, though that number is genuinely debated. What isn't debated is the planning it represents. The rooms aren't randomly arranged. Storage rooms cluster together. Living spaces connect in ways that suggest household groupings. The kivas are distributed in a pattern that probably reflects the different kin groups sharing the space. This isn't a collection of individual decisions. It's coordinated architecture expressing a social structure in stone. Spruce Tree House, slightly smaller but extraordinarily well preserved, gives you an even cleaner look at how daily life might have been organized. Around 130 rooms, 8 kivas, built into an alcove roughly 216 feet wide and 89 feet deep. The rooms at the back of the alcove were used primarily for storage, which tells you something immediately about priorities. In an environment where a failed harvest could mean starvation, protecting your food supply was worth prime real estate. Living spaces occupied the middle ground. Kivas sat where they could be accessed by multiple household groups. Even the arrangement of the site reads like a document about what mattered to the people who designed it. Now think about the logistics. Every beam you can see in those ceilings, and there are thousands of them across the Mesa Verde sites combined, was cut, stripped, and carried on foot, often over rugged terrain, from forests on the mesa top or in the mountains beyond. The sandstone blocks were shaped with harder stone tools and set with mortar made from local materials. Water had to be hauled up from springs in the canyon floor, sometimes up ladders and hand-cut toe holds carved into near-vertical cliff faces. A single trip for water wasn't a quick walk to the faucet. It was a commitment of time and physical effort, done multiple times a day by multiple people. Access to these sites was deliberately difficult. You reached them by climbing, using hand and toe holds cut into the rock, or wooden ladders that could be pulled up. This is often described as a defensive feature, and it probably was, at least in part. But there's a trade-off embedded in that choice that's worth sitting with. Every design decision that made a site harder for an enemy to reach also made it harder for a resident to move through their own day. Hauling corn down from the fields on the mesa top, bringing water up from below, getting an elderly person in or out, getting a child with a broken leg to safety. The cliff location solved certain problems and created others in the same stroke. And yet people invested enormously in them. Not just labour, but generations of accumulated knowledge about how to maintain a structure in a cliff alcove, how to manage the smoke from interior hearths, how to waterproof roof timbers against moisture that crept in from above. These were places people committed to, which is what makes the abandonment so hard to explain through purely rational calculus. The word city deserves some attention here, because it's both useful and slightly misleading. These weren't cities in the way medieval Baghdad or Song dynasty Hangzhou were cities. There was no permanent administrative class, no professional army, no single ruler. But there was density, there was planning, there was a communal life organised around shared spaces and shared ceremonial cycles. The kivas weren't private rooms. They were places where groups came together for rituals that reinforced social bonds and probably managed collective decisions. The plazas and open areas within larger complexes were spaces for gathering, for the ceremonies that marked planting and harvest, for the social negotiations that kept multi-clan communities functioning without a centralized authority to impose order. There was also seasonality built into how these places were used. Some researchers think certain cliff dwellings may not have been occupied year-round by their full populations. The agricultural cycle pulled people onto the mesa tops during planting and harvest seasons. The cliff sites may have been more intensively occupied in the winter months, when the alcoves offered protection from cold winds and the stored food in the back rooms sustained the community through the season with the least work. All of which makes the question sharper. You don't carve toeholds into a cliff face and haul timber for miles, and build 150 rooms over multiple generations unless you believe in the future of the place you're building. You don't invest that kind of labour in a temporary solution. The cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde represent not just engineering, but faith. Faith that this location, this community, this way of organising a life in a demanding landscape was worth everything it cost to sustain. And then, within a human lifetime, it was over. The rooms were emptied, the ladders came down. The alcoves that had held living communities fell silent. What pushed people to that point isn't a single clean answer. It's a set of pressures that built on each other over decades, and untangling them is exactly what makes this one of the most debated questions in American archaeology. If you walk into one of those empty cliff dwellings today, you're stepping into a crime scene where the body is missing and the witnesses are all dead. What we have left are traces, architecture, trash, charred wood, broken pots, grains of pollen so small they ride the wind and get trapped in mud. Everything we think we know about why people left these places is built out of those traces. Start with the stone itself. Architecture is one of the clearest voices in the archaeological record, and it talks even when everything else is gone. The way rooms are arranged, where doors and windows face, how many kivas there are and how they're distributed across a site. All of that is information. You can see community organisation in floor plans. A cluster of small rooms around a kiva hints at a household or a clan group. Long, narrow storage rooms tell you that surplus food wasn't just produced, it was planned for. Tower-like structures near the canyon edge might signal lookout points, or something ceremonial, or both. When you map dozens of sites and compare them, you start to see patterns over time. Villages that used to be spread out on the mesa tops become more compact. Kivas that used to be scattered become more tightly grouped, or are replaced by fewer, larger, great kivas. Entrances that used to be open to the landscape turn inward, toward enclosed plazas. None of that tells you exactly what anyone was thinking, but it does tell you that how they were living changed, and those changes cluster in time around the decades before the big abandonments. Ceramics add another layer. Pottery is one of archaeology's favourite lines of evidence, not because it's beautiful, though it often is, but because it breaks. Constantly. Every time a jar shatters in a hearth or a bowl gets dropped in a courtyard, it leaves behind fragments that endure for centuries. Those fragments carry style. The way a potter coils and scrapes the clay, the distinctive mineral mix in the slip, the painted designs, spirals, stepped patterns, black on white versus black on red, all of that can be incredibly specific to a region or even a single community. In the southwest, ceramic sequences have been built so carefully that archaeologists can sometimes date a potsherd to within a few decades just by its style. And this is where migration starts to come into focus. If you find a mesa-top village whose pottery is overwhelmingly of one local style for generations, and then over a short span of time that style disappears and is replaced by a different one from hundreds of miles away, that's a signal. Either a flood of imported pots suddenly arrived, or the people making pots changed. When you see that same new style appearing at new settlements downriver at exactly the same time, the imported pots explanation starts to look less likely. You're probably watching population move. Architecture and ceramics talk to each other. A new village laid out in a way that's typical of one region, with pottery that's characteristic of another, suggests a mixed population. People from different areas coming together, bringing their own building traditions and pottery styles, and negotiating a new community plan. When those combinations appear after big abandonments upstream, they begin to look like the fingerprints of refugees. Then there's the stuff no one meant to leave behind. Middens and hearths. Middens are trash piles, and in this context, Trash means gold. Broken tools, worn-out sandals, corn cobs, animal bones, ash from hearth clean-outs, all get tossed in more or less the same place year after year. Layer builds on layer. When you cut through that mound centuries later, you're reading a stack of annual reports. Animal bones in those middens tell you what people were eating and how that changed through time. Lots of deer and rabbit early on, more rodents and small birds later. That's a sign big game was getting harder to find, that people were scraping the barrel of the ecosystem more aggressively. A shift from wild plant remains to domesticated crops, or from diverse wild foods to heavy reliance on corn, hints at how flexible or fragile the food system was. Hearths hold clues too. Charcoal from cooking fires can be identified to species. You can tell whether people were burning pinyon pine, juniper, cottonwood, or even dried corn cobs. When the fuel source shifts from large, high-quality firewood to scrub and agricultural byproducts, it probably means the closest forests have been cut over and people are adapting to scarcity. Sometimes they adapted so thoroughly that you can track the decline of entire woodlands. That's where one of the Southwest's secret weapons comes in: tree rings. If archaeology had a cheat code, in this region it would be dendrochronology, tree ring dating. The high, dry plateaus of the Four Corners preserve wood beautifully. Those roof beams you see in cliff dwellings, many of them still have intact rings. Each ring is 1 year of growth. Wide rings mean good growing conditions. Narrow rings mean drought or cold. And because trees in the same region respond to climate in similar ways, their ring patterns can be matched and overlapped, creating a continuous calendar stretching back more than 2,000 years. That means two astonishing things are possible. First, you can often tell exactly when a particular beam was cut. Not roughly, not somewhere in this century, sometimes down to the exact year, occasionally even the season. If a roof beam at a Mesa Verde dwelling has its outermost ring dating to, say, 1278, you know someone cut that tree in 1278, trimmed the bark and hauled it back. People were still investing in that building in that specific year. Second, the ring widths across thousands of trees give you a precise year-by-year record of climate. When there were good decades for moisture, when there were brutal droughts, when the pattern flipped rapidly. When you line up the last use dates of beams in cliff dwellings with that climate record, you see something stark. Construction booms during relatively favourable periods. Repairs and additions taper off as droughts bite. Then, in the late 1200s, a cluster of last use dates, a kind of architectural full stop. And remember, that climate signal isn't just local. Tree ring chronologies tie into wider regional patterns. They show that the worst drought episodes weren't just a dry year or two, but sustained, landscape-scale stress over multiple decades. Enough time for wells to fail, for corn harvest to crash repeatedly, for forests to be cut faster than they could regrow. Now, fold pollen into that picture. Pollen analysis sounds almost absurdly delicate, but it's one of the sharpest tools we have for reconstructing past environments. Every flowering plant produces pollen grains, and those grains get blown into lakes, sink into marshes, collect in cracks and crevices. Over centuries they accumulate in stratified layers. Take a core of mud from a lake bed, slice it layer by layer, and you're reading a history of the plants that used to live in that watershed. In layers corresponding to the centuries before the big abandonment, you can see the fingerprints of agriculture spread. More corn pollen, more weedy species that thrive in disturbed fields, fewer pollen grains from mature woodland trees. In some places the signal of pinyon and juniper declines sharply, replaced by shrubs and grasses, a sign that fuel wood and building timber were being harvested faster than the ecosystem could recover. When those vegetation changes line up with tree ring evidence of drought, and with archaeological evidence of heavier dependence on stored corn, you start to see pressure building from multiple directions at once. Climate stress, deforestation, soil exhaustion. Migration leaves its own architectural ghosts. After the cliff dwellings and mesotop towns were emptied, new villages sprang up along rivers farther south and east. Some of those new settlements share very particular traits with the abandoned communities. Similar plaza and kiva layouts, similar arrangements of room blocks, similar orientations to the cardinal directions or to sacred landmarks on the horizon. In the Rio Grande Valley, you see the rise of large, plaza-focused pueblos, where the layout seems to echo, in a new form, the social organization implied by earlier sites. Kivas reappear in different guises, sometimes square instead of round, sometimes integrated differently into the village. Certain ceremonial features like alignments to solstice sunrise points or particular types of underground chambers show up again, suggesting that ritual life moved with people, even as it adapted. Ceramics reinforce that story. Pottery styles that were once distinctive to the Mesa Verde region begin to appear in smaller percentages in faraway pueblos, mingling with local styles. Conversely, entirely new decorative traditions emerge in the centuries after the abandonment, which may represent communities coalescing from multiple streams of migrants, each bringing their own iconography and blending it into something new. All of this sounds almost neatly plotted, but there are hard limits on how confidently any of these lines of evidence can speak. For one thing, silence is ambiguous. An absence of artifacts in a layer might mean people left. It might also mean their trash was moved, or later activities destroyed earlier deposits, or that no one has dug in exactly the right place yet. Looting, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, ripped open rooms and kivas, removing pottery, tools, even human remains without documenting where they came from. Entire chapters of evidence were effectively torn out of the book before anyone tried to read it. Firewood gets reused. Roof beams can be salvaged from older structures and built into new ones. So a date on a piece of wood might tell you when the tree died, not when the house was actually abandoned. Pottery can travel as trade goods and heirlooms, not just as luggage in the hands of migrants. A shift in pottery styles could signal new fashions spreading through trade networks, rather than wholesale population movement. And then there are our own eyes. Modern biases colour what we think we see. We live in a world of borders and nation-states, so it's easy to imagine migration as one big, sudden exodus, lines of refugees marching out of the cliffs one fateful year. That image is cinematic and emotionally powerful. It's also almost certainly wrong. When people say the ancestral Pueblo vanished overnight, they're using a kind of storytelling shorthand. What the evidence really supports is a much messier timeline. Tree ring data and last use dates on beams suggest that many major cliff dwellings in the Mesa Verde region were no longer being maintained or repaired by the early 1280s, with occupation tapering off over perhaps a few decades. Some smaller sites were likely vacated earlier, some pockets may have hung on later. Across the broader four corners, the process of aggregating into larger centres and then abandoning them played out over something like 50 to 100 years. That's fast in archaeological terms. It's the span of 2 or 3 long human lives. For a story told at the scale of centuries, it can look like a sharp break. But for the people living it, it would have felt like a long, grinding series of hard choices. This field failing, that spring going dry, this year's harvest not quite enough. Another neighbouring village showing up to share a dwindling water source. So when we say overnight, what we often mean is, inside a single cultural horizon, a rapid reorganisation of where people lived and how they identified themselves, compressed into a few generations. Fast enough to shock the archaeological record, slow enough that, at the time, it probably felt like an escalating pattern rather than a single event. That's the tension that runs through this whole mystery. The traces we can measure with great precision, tree rings, pollen, ceramic sequences, architectural changes, are constantly pulling us toward neat narratives. But the gaps, the silences, the places where looters or erosion or simple chance have erased whole chapters, remind us that we're reconstructing lives out of fragments. Those fragments are still enough to show pressure building. Climate tightening the screws, forests thinning, animals disappearing from the middens, villages pulling in on themselves, building higher walls and deeper kivas, pottery styles and architectural plans hinting at movement, mixing, redefinition. The question is what it felt like from the inside in those last years before the ladders came down for the final time. Imagine waking up in one of those cliff dwellings in the late 1270s. The morning light would creep slowly into the alcove, hitting the plastered walls and the smoke-darkened rafters. Your day is already scheduled, not by a clock but by the needs of corn, water, and wood. Farming isn't a background activity at this point. It's the spine of existence. Up on the mesa tops or out along canyon benches, small fields of corn, beans, and squash sit at the edge of what's possible. By the late 1200s, tree rings and pollen suggest you're farming in a landscape that's already been worked hard. That means your planting schedule isn't just when the rains come, because the rains have been unreliable for years. It's a layered calculation. Snowpack from the last winter, how deeply the last few storms soaked the soil, the gossip from relatives upstream about springs running low. You plant in scattered patches to hedge your bets. Some fields catch runoff from slick rock. Others are tucked into sandy pockets where moisture lingers a little longer. You might stagger planting dates across weeks, so that if a dry spell hits one cohort of seedlings, others might squeak through. Farming has become a game of probability management. Storage is the other half of that game. When archaeologists tally up storage rooms and sealed jars in late 1200 sites, they see a world obsessed with buffering the future. Tall, narrow rooms with thick plastered walls, subfloor bins, clay-lined pits, jars carefully tucked into corners, their mouths sealed with stone slabs and adobe. This isn't the storage of casual surplus. This is a system where having 2 or 3 bad harvests in a row is not hypothetical. It's recent memory. Every ear of corn that goes into storage carries a decision. Eat it now and feel full, or save it in case next year is worse. That kind of thinking runs through everything. How much wood you burn in winter, how much water you use on a dry day, whether you eat the last of the beans or keep them as seed. Risk is no longer a distant possibility. It's in the room with you. The bones in the middens hint at that risk. In earlier centuries, people here ate plenty of deer, rabbits, and medium-sized game. By the late 1200s at many sites, those decline. You see more small, fast, low-return animals, rodents, tiny birds, lizards. They're harder to catch and offer less meat, but they're what's left when larger animals have been hunted steadily in a shrinking habitat. Some researchers see that as a sign of real stress on the food system. Others caution that hunting strategies can shift for social or ritual reasons too. But in context, with drought, deforestation, and population aggregation, the pattern looks like a narrowing of options. Diet changes show up in more subtle ways too. Chemical analysis of human bones from this period suggests heavier reliance on maize than before. Corn was always important, but when your stable isotope starts screaming maize, 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 it suggests fewer wild plant foods buffering the system. That's a more brittle diet. If one staple fails, you don't have as many backups. Architecture in the final decades reflects that tightening world. In many cliff dwellings and mesa-top towns, you see a burst of construction earlier in the 1200s. New room blocks, expanded plazas, additional kivas. But by the late 1270s and 1280s, the pattern shifts. Fewer new rooms, more repairs, walls patched and replastered multiple times, roof beams replaced or braced, corners shored up. It looks like people working hard to maintain what they have rather than expanding into new space. Even the style of building changes. Doorways get smaller and more controlled. Sightlines from plazas to the outside world get more restricted. Some sites show increased use of second-story access, internal ladders, and blocked-off earlier entrances. Archaeologists read that as a move toward defensibility, or at least toward greater control over who can go where and when. But here is where interpretation gets slippery. The same construction patterns that could signal fear of attack could also map onto changing ritual ideas, new concepts of privacy, or status differences inside the community. A thicker wall might mean fortification, or it might mean someone simply wanted better insulation in a colder phase. A blocked doorway could signify defense, or a shift in ritual pathways, reorienting how people were meant to move through ceremonial spaces. Population patterns add another layer of ambiguity. Across the four corners, there's strong evidence that in the decades before abandonment, people were clustering. Smaller hamlets and farmsteads on the mesas and inside canyons were often abandoned first, their residents moving into larger, more centralized communities, especially into impressive cliff dwellings and big mesa-top compounds. That clustering suggests multiple things at once. More people in one place means more hands to defend a village if needed. It means larger ceremonies, more complex rituals, wider marriage choices, stronger social ties. It also concentrates demand. More mouths drawing from the same springs, more fields drawing from the same catchment, more houses needing firewood from already depleted pinyon juniper stands. Some archaeologists see this aggregation as a classic late-stage move, people under stress pulling in together for mutual support. Others emphasize the opportunities it created for new forms of leadership, redistribution, and shared labor. A tightly packed village allows for communal storage and large-scale projects, terracing, check dams, irrigation or runoff management features that scattered households could never have managed alone. At the same time, not everyone was clustering. In some regions, there's evidence of dispersal, small groups peeling off from big centres to occupy marginal areas, short-lived farmsteads, or less defensible spots. These could be families trying one last time to make local lands work, or offshoots maintaining ties, but keeping some distance from crowded politics-heavy centres. Or they could be signals of people already leaving the region in stages, stepping stone moves toward new homelands. Conflict hovers over all of this like a shadow that never quite resolves into a clear shape. There are sites with burned structures and indications that they were burned while still in use. Some kivas and room blocks show layers of ash, charred beams fallen in place, collapsed roofs that look less like controlled dismantling and more like sudden destruction. In a few cases, human remains are found in strange positions, unburied, mixed with rubble. Circumstances, some scholars argue, are consistent with violent events. You can also see changes in weaponry. Projectile points get smaller and more standardized in some areas, a shift that could reflect more intensive hunting, or an increased emphasis on warfare and raiding. Defensive locations, those cliff alcoves with limited entry points, villages tucked behind narrow choke points, become more common late in the sequence. Yet every piece of conflict evidence is contested. A burned building might come from an accident, a ritual burning when a house was deliberately closed, or lightning strike. Unburied remains might be victims of disease, or people left behind in a hurried move, or casualties of interpersonal violence. Even fortified-looking layouts can be interpreted as status displays, ritual enclosures, or responses to non-human threats like predators. The written record that would resolve these questions, accounts of raids, alliances, feuds, doesn't exist for this place and time. Oral traditions among descendant Pueblo communities sometimes speak of warfare, of enemy outsiders, of migrations forced by danger. But collapsing those stories directly onto specific Mesa Verde sites is risky. They're living narratives shaped by centuries of retelling. What's clearer is the mood that archaeology hints at: uncertainty. Late 1200s households are operating on thinner margins. They're maintaining complex architecture while juggling erratic harvests. They're navigating more crowded social worlds while the ecological safety net frays. In that environment, the question, do we stay, is no longer hypothetical. Staying put has obvious advantages. These are ancestral places layered with meaning. Springs and seeps have stories tied to them. Kivas hold lineages and ceremonies rooted in that exact ground. Fields are known. Which patch holds soil longer, which slope frosts last in the spring, which corner catches the first summer rains. The rock itself is mapped by generations of experience. Tiny cues of cloud shape or wind direction that predict a storm. The subtle colour change in the cliff that tells you a seep is still flowing. Leaving would mean stepping into landscapes where those mental maps are weaker, where other communities already live, where your rights to use water, to plant fields, to build shrines, would have to be negotiated or claimed. So what would push a community past that tipping point? Archaeologists look for triggers, a particularly bad string of years in the tree ring record, a burn layer that lines up with a drought spike, a final burst of repair followed by silence in the architectural sequence. Maybe a neighbouring site fails, sending refugees into your village. Maybe a key spring runs dry, forcing people to haul water from farther away. Or a sequence of failed harvests pushes everyone into the red, eating more of the stored seed corn, cutting deeper into the reserves that were supposed to bridge the next year. Some models imagine a threshold effect. For a while, you can buffer the shocks with storage, by tightening belts, by expanding trade. But once too many subsystems are stressed at once, soils depleted, forests cut back, big game scarce, rainfall unreliable, the risk of total collapse rises. At that point, staying is no longer the conservative choice. It's a gamble against mounting odds. Others emphasize social factors. Leadership disputes, factionalism, or religious movements could have reframed leaving from a failure into a fulfillment of obligation. Ritual knowledge might have prescribed migration when certain signs appeared. Eclipses, comet appearances, drought sequences interpreted through sacred calendars. In that reading, the tipping point isn't just ecological crisis. It's a moment when cosmology, politics, and environment align to say, this cycle is finished. It's time to move. We can't hear the arguments that must have filled plazas and kivas in those years. Elders insisting that the rains would return as they always had. Younger people pointing to empty middens, dry springs, and burned-out forests. Families torn between loyalty to place and the pull of relatives already gone to new valleys. What we do see is the outcome in slow motion. Repairs tapering off, storage rooms left partially full or carefully cleaned out, trash middens no longer receiving new layers, ceramic styles that once clustered in one canyon suddenly appearing in diluted form far to the south and east. From our vantage point centuries later, it's tempting to frame those last years as a countdown to abandonment. But for the people living them, they were years of work, adaptation, and difficult, often delayed decisions. Every planting season might have been the last in that field. Every plastered wall might have been patched with the knowledge that it would someday be left behind. The ladders didn't all come down in a single night. They came down household by household, clan by clan, over a span of years in which staying gradually shifted from default to untenable. And when the final families did shoulder their loads and climb out of those alcoves for the last time, they didn't walk into emptiness. They stepped into a larger landscape already strained, already in motion, where drought, deforestation, and human decisions were converging into something bigger than any single canyon. To understand why those decisions tipped toward leaving, you have to sit with the drought. Not a bad summer, not a "the monsoon was late this year" kind of dry spell. The late 1200s in the northern southwest line up with what climatologists now call a mega-drought, an unusually long, unusually intense period of a low precipitation spread across much of the region. On the ground, that doesn't look like a single dramatic catastrophe. It looks like 5 years in a row where the snowpack is thin and disappears too fast. It looks like spring winds that strip moisture from the soil before the corn is knee-high. It's planting and replanting because the first seeds never germinate. It's watching the storm clouds form over the horizon, build in those towering afternoon columns, and then blow past without dropping rain. Maize is a hardy plant in some ways. It can handle hot days and cool nights. It doesn't mind a bit of stress. But it has a few non-negotiables. It needs enough moisture at germination to push roots down. It needs water at pollination so tassels and silks can do their work. Miss those windows, and your harvest collapses, no matter how much sweat you put into weeding or how carefully you placed each seed. In a normal sequence of years, a bad season is buffered. You lean on storage. You rely more heavily on wild foods. You tighten social ties, trading with relatives in a valley that did better. But when the bad years come one after another, buffering turns into triage. The tree rings say those bad years stacked up. Each year, a conifer in the high country records how it felt about the climate in a thin band of wood. Plenty of moisture and a decent growing season, and the ring is wide. Drought, and it shrinks to a tight, dark line. Dendrochronologists, scientists who read those rings like ledgers, have built huge regional databases of old trees and archaeological timbers. When they lay them side by side, the late 1200s jump out as a cluster of narrow rings stretched over decades, punctuated by the occasional brief recovery that never quite resets the system. Those same patterns echo in other records too. In lake beds, layers of mud settle year after year. During wet periods, the sediment looks one way. In dry periods, it shifts. Different grain sizes, different pollen, different chemistry. Cores pulled from lakes in Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona show signs of reduced water levels and altered vegetation communities right when ancestral Pueblo towns are struggling. Even stalagmites and caves, growing drip by drip over centuries, lock in clues. Their oxygen isotopes respond to changes in rainfall. When researchers analyze them, they find evidence of sustained dryness overlapping with the final occupation of Mesa Verde and neighboring regions. None of these independent lines of evidence is perfect on its own. Together they paint a consistent picture. The people of those cliff dwellings were living through a brutal dry spell on top of decades of already uneven rainfall. For a farming household, a mega-drought is not one story. It's a sequence. First year, the corn comes in light. Cobs are small, some kernels don't fill out. You dip a little deeper into the storage jars than you'd planned. You tell yourself you've seen worse. Second year, late frosts nip the early plants. That promising June storm doesn't materialize. By harvest time, you're measuring out rations, calculating how thin you can slice the winter. You still hold back seed, but you're arguing at the hearth about how much. Third year, the seed you saved is less than ideal. Maybe it came from stressed plants. Maybe you had to mix in grain you'd rather have eaten. The yield drops again. Now you're not just eating through surplus, you're eroding the core stock that future harvests depend on. Every pot of corn you cook is also a vote about whether your children will have enough seed to plant next spring. That's where child survival rates become brutally sensitive to climate. Infants and small children are the first to feel the crunch. A slightly smaller adult portion can be managed. A missed meal for a toddler hits much harder. When archaeologists look at skeletal remains from drought-associated sequences in the southwest, not just at Mesa Verde but across the broader region, they often see increased signs of nutritional stress, enamel defects on teeth, growth interruptions, higher frequencies of childhood mortality. These aren't numbers carved in stone. Sample sizes are small and interpretations are debated. But layered with the climate record, they suggest that dry years translate directly into lost children. And it's not just food. Drought also means springs that once ran all year start going intermittent. Pools that normally linger into late summer dry by midsummer. Water quality declines as flow rates drop. More pathogens, more sediment, more concentration of whatever else is upstream. Hauling water farther, more often, in hotter conditions while eating less is a recipe for exhaustion and illness. A child surviving a bout of diarrhea in a wet year might not make it through in a drought year. All of that is happening while your food system is more maize-heavy than ever. The isotopes in late 1200 skeletons say that many communities are leaning harder on corn and less on the diverse mix of wild seeds, tubers and greens that had buffered earlier centuries. Maize is fantastically productive when conditions cooperate. It's unforgiving when they don't. In a mega-drought, that dependence becomes a liability. If your main staple is sensitive to moisture and moisture fails, there aren't enough backups to go around. The striking thing is that we can align climate and occupation histories pretty precisely. Many of the big Mesa Verde sites, Cliff Palace, Spruce Tree House, Longhouse, see their final use right in the teeth of a severe dry interval in the late 1270s and 1280s. Timber dates cluster before that. Then new construction stops. Trash deposition wanes. By the time the climate record suggests a slight easing, those places are already empty. It's tempting to draw a straight arrow. Drought hits. People leave. But the map complicates that simple line. Some areas hit hard by the same regional drought weren't abandoned. Parts of the Rio Grande Valley and certain stretches of the Little Colorado and Zuni regions show continuous occupation across the late 1200s into the 1300s. People there also experienced low precipitation and erratic rainfall, but their villages didn't empty out in the same way. Meanwhile, other high, marginal zones comparable to Mesa Verde had already been losing population before the very worst drought years arrived. In Chaco Canyon, major great houses were being modified, repurposed or partially abandoned as early as the mid-1100s, well before the final Mesa Verde exodus. In other words, climate is one actor on the stage, but it walks in and out of scenes that were already in motion. Local resilience mattered. A village anchored near a reliable river or big spring, one fed by distant snowpack or deep aquifers, might ride out the same dry spell that devastated rain-fed upland farms. A community with access to multiple ecological zones, low floodplains, mid-slope fields, high pastures, had more options to shuffle around risk. Political and ritual ties mattered too. Places plugged into strong exchange networks could import food or people in bad years, spreading the impact. Others, more isolated or already strained by internal conflict, might break faster. That unevenness is one of the main reasons most archaeologists today shy away from saying, drought caused the abandonment. Climate provided the stress test. How different communities fared under that test depended on local geology, soils, social organisation, earlier history and plain luck. But even where drought wasn't a death sentence, it was a force multiplier. Take soil, for example. Fields that had produced for generations did so in part because people invested in them, building check dams, terraces, contour rows to slow runoff and store water in place. Under normal conditions, those features smooth out the ups and downs of yearly rainfall. Under prolonged drought, they're working with less and less to begin with. A single midsummer cloudburst on parched ground can tear out years of labour in an afternoon, flushing precious topsoil down the canyon. One bad storm in a dry year can destroy the very infrastructure meant to protect you. Forest use is another multiplier. By the late 1200s, the pinyon juniper woodlands around big villages had been cut for fuel, construction, and cooking for generations. In a wet cycle, those forests regrow slowly. In a drought, regeneration stalls. People have to walk farther for wood, which eats into time and calories that could have gone to fields, repairs, or ritual obligations. A household already on the edge nutritionally can't easily absorb that extra burden. And then there's conflict. In a landscape of marginal surplus, raiding suddenly makes more sense to desperate neighbours and small groups on the move. A granary that might have been respected as off-limits in better times becomes a tempting target when your own children are losing weight. Episodes of violence that might once have been isolated flashpoints can start to chain together when there's no slack in the system. The archaeological traces of burned rooms, hurried abandonments, and unburied bodies become more plausible against a backdrop of tight resources and failing harvests. Even social tensions intensify. Leadership that was tolerated when bellies were full becomes suspect when decisions don't produce rain. Ritual specialists who once interpreted drought as a test may find their authority questioned when the test never ends. Factions that disagreed quietly in normal years may split openly when staying together means sharing dwindling stores. Drought doesn't invent these problems, it sharpens them. It removes the margin for error. In that sense, the mega-drought of the late 1200s is less a single cause than an amplifier. It takes whatever is already fragile, soils, forests, food systems, political alliances, ritual calendars, and pushes them closer to their breaking points at the same time. Instead of one subsystem failing in isolation, multiple ones falter together. When you look at the timing of abandonment through that lens, a different picture emerges. It's not drought versus conflict, or climate versus religion, as competing explanations. It's drought as the backdrop that makes conflict more likely, religion more urgent, social upheaval more appealing, and migration more thinkable. By the time the last families at Mesa Verde were debating whether to stay, the rains had become something more than just weather. They were a verdict, a commentary on the existing way of life. Each failed storm wasn't just a missed opportunity for moisture. It was another data point in a growing argument that this place, however sacred and storied, might no longer be inhabitable in the way their grandparents had known. And yet people didn't simply surrender to the sky. They adjusted. They built new terraces, tried new planting patterns, experimented with different field locations, leaned harder on social networks and ceremony. They squeezed every drop of adaptability from a system that had already carried them through centuries of variable climate. The question becomes, where do you go when all of that still isn't enough? To answer that, you have to look down at the ground itself, at the fields, the forests, and the thin ribbon of usable soil that was quietly eroding under their feet. Start with the soil, because in the northern southwest soil is destiny. The mesas and canyons where many ancestral Pueblo towns sit are not Iowa. They're thin skins of weathered rock and wind-blown dust draped over sandstone and shale. In some places you get a pocket of deep, loamy earth in a swale that catches runoff. In others, you're planting in a few inches of sandy sediment perched above bedrock, hoping your check dams will slow the water just long enough for roots to chase it down. Early farmers were careful with those pockets. We see it in the Archaeology. People favoured certain slopes, certain exposures, certain benches again and again across centuries. They built small stone alignments to trap silt. They left intrusive rock in place to break the wind and shade the ground. They planted where the land could forgive mistakes. But there are only so many forgiving places. As populations grew through the thousands and 1100s, more mouths meant more fields. The best patches were already taken, so households started pushing into marginal soils, thinner, rockier, riskier. You can make those fields work, especially in a run of decent years. Manure helps. Letting a plot lie fallow helps. Careful terracing and contouring help. But every time you scrape away one more stone to make room for a planting hole, you're also exposing a bit more surface to the wind and to the sudden violence of summer storms. Think about what happens over generations. A new household clears a patch on a gentle slope. They build low stone walls to slow runoff. The first few years are good. Fresh soil, decent moisture, thick stands of corn and beans. They harvest, they weed, they walk those fields every day. The soil is living. Microorganisms, insects, organic matter building up from roots and leaf litter. But farming is extraction. You're pulling nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients out of that soil every season, loading them into grain, into bodies, into the ash from cooking fires. Some of it cycles back when you spread waste and ash on the fields. Some of it doesn't. If fallowing cycles are short because population pressure is high, the land doesn't have time to recover. Then add erosion. In a semi-arid environment, a lot of your annual water comes in bursts, summer thunderstorms that can dump huge amounts in an hour and then vanish. If the ground is covered in plants, those roots and stems slow the flow, water infiltrates, fine sediments settle in place. If the ground is bare because your crops failed, or you had to overweed to fight pests, the same storm turns into a scouring sheet. Topsoil peels off and heads downhill. The darker, richer fraction of the soil, the part with the most organic matter, goes first. Over decades, the field literally lowers itself. The stones that were once below the surface end up on top. The planting holes get shallower, drier. Each new generation inherits land that requires more work for less yield. We can see traces of this in some upland farming areas near the big cliff dwellings. Deeply incised gullies cut through what would once have been more gently sloping ground. Remnants of older check dams sit stranded above modern drainages, testifying to former soil levels that have long since washed away. In some places, ancient agricultural terraces are now so thin that even with modern water they struggle to support dense vegetation. Something was taken out and not fully returned. Now pair that with forest use. Those stone cities weren't conjured from nothing. Every beam in a roof, every post in a kiva, every ladder, every drying rack came from somewhere. The main building timbers at Mesa Verde and similar sites are mostly conifer, ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, spruce, cut from higher elevation forests. Those are big, slow-growing trees. You don't replace a mature beam in a human lifetime. Fuelwood is different. For daily cooking and heating, people leaned heavily on pinyon pine and juniper in the surrounding woodlands. Those trees grow closer to the settlements and regrow faster than high country conifers, but faster here still means decades, not years. Archaeologists have mapped out how this demand likely rippled across the landscape. Close to the big centres, the easiest wood was cut first. Over time, people had to walk farther and farther to gather the same amount. Ethnographic analogy from later Pueblo communities suggests fuel gathering could consume a significant slice of a household's labour, especially in winter. Were the mesas around Mesa Verde actually deforested in the modern sense? That's debated. Some studies of ancient pollen and charcoal suggest a decline in local woodlands near major sites by the late 1200s. Others argue that regional forests remained patchy but present, and that people were probably very aware of the need to manage them. It's unlikely that farmers who depended on pinyon nuts, juniper berries, and accessible fuel would simply strip their surroundings mindlessly. But you don't need a moonscape to feel the pressure. If the nearest good woodlot is now a half-day's walk away instead of an hour, that's time and energy you're not spending on fields, on repairs, on childcare, on ritual obligations. In bad years when food is already tight, that extra labour becomes costly. Cut younger trees because you're desperate for fuel, and you further slow the woodland's recovery, locking in the spiral. The same logic applies to wild game. Before and alongside maize farming, the Southwest food web included deer, elk, rabbits, turkeys, and a host of smaller animals. Hunting and trapping were never bonus activities. They were core parts of the subsistence system, especially as insurance against poor harvests. Over centuries of dense settlement, though, animals learn. Around major pueblos, constant human presence, dogs and noise push larger game farther out. Easy-to-catch species, the ones that don't spook as fast or reproduce as quickly, get thinned. Archaeologists can sometimes track this in the bones left in trash deposits. In some sequences, early layers show a higher proportion of big game remains, deer and elk. Later layers near big towns skew more toward rabbits, rodents, and domestic turkeys. That shift can mean many things: changing preferences, evolving ritual practices, deliberate turkey husbandry. But in other parts of the world, similar patterns often correlate with local depletion of large wild game. Again, the issue isn't that every deer vanished from the four corners. It's that the radius of reliable hunting may have expanded beyond what was easy for farmers to integrate into their already crowded schedules. A day you spend trekking miles to reach decent hunting grounds is a day you're not irrigating fields, repairing terraces, or attending politically important ceremonies. You can start to see a theme: soil that requires more labour for less return, forests that require longer trips for fuel and timber, game that requires greater range and skill to hunt. Each on its own is manageable. Humans are ingenious at shuffling tasks, sharing labour, making do. And they did manage for a very long time. There's good evidence that ancestral Pueblo communities didn't wait passively for problems to arrive. They invested heavily in water management features, check dams and small drainages, rock-mulched fields that conserved moisture, contour terraces that slowed erosion. They likely rotated fields and fallows, shifted plots upslope or downslope as conditions changed, and diversified plantings, mixing maize with beans and squash to spread risk and replenish soil nitrogen. Wood use shows signs of adaptation too. At some sites, archaeologists find an increasing proportion of smaller diameter beams and reused timbers in later construction phases, suggesting people were conserving large trees, scavenging abandoned structures, and making do with what was available rather than cutting fresh old growth indiscriminately. Even hunting patterns can reflect conscious management. Emphasis on turkeys, which can be penned and fed household scraps and maize, may have been a way to convert plant calories into animal protein, without relying entirely on wild populations. Careful harvesting of rabbits and other small game, following seasonal and ritual rules, can sustain local populations for long periods. In other words, resource management wasn't an afterthought. It was built into the culture. Ritual calendars tied to planting and hunting seasons, clan responsibilities for certain shrines or springs, taboos about when and where to cut particular trees. These are all ways societies encode conservation without calling it that. When anthropologists look at later Pueblo traditions, they see layers of rules and stories that, among other things, keep people from overusing critical resources. So why would such a system reach its limits? Partly because even the best management assumes a certain range of conditions. Terraces are designed for storms of a certain intensity. forestry growth rates are tuned to rainfall cycles of a certain frequency. Game reproduction depends on vegetation that depends on roughly predictable moisture. If climate shifts outside those bounds, if droughts are longer, or storm events more erosive, then the engineering that once stabilized the landscape can start to fail. Imagine a check dam built to catch runoff from ordinary thunderstorms. It works beautifully, trapping silt, deepening soil behind it, turning a narrow wash into a productive strip. Then you get a sequence of years where the small, soaking rains mostly don't come, and the few storms that do arrive unleash torrents on bone-dry ground. The dam gets overtopped, undercut, ripped out. The soil it had trapped is swept away in a single evening. Now your field is not just unproductive, it's physically gone. Scale that up across a whole community's infrastructure during a mega-drought, and even decades of careful investment can be undone quickly. Population density amplifies all of this. On a lightly settled landscape, when one set of fields fails or a woodland is overcut, a family can shift to another valley, another bench, another spring. There's slack. By the late 1200s in the northern San Juan region, that slack was reduced. You have multiple large villages, hundreds or thousands of people, all drawing from overlapping catchments of soil, forest and game. The best lands close to water are already intensively used. The marginal lands are already claimed and modified. When drought tightens its grip on such a system, there are fewer blank spaces on the map to absorb displaced households. Moving 10 miles might just put you into another community's strained orbit. Negotiating access becomes a political act, not just a practical one. So environmental strain doesn't sit off to the side of the drought story. It interlocks with it. Dry years make soil thinner and more vulnerable to erosion. Thinner soil makes each dry year hit harder. Drought slows forest regrowth. Slow regrowth makes each winter's fuel needs more burdensome. Reduced vegetation stresses game populations. Stressed game makes hunting a riskier hedge against crop failure. In a landscape full of people, these feedback loops tighten. Think of the late 1200s not as a single tipping point, but as the period when a lot of these curves, soil depletion, forest distance, game scarcity, infrastructure failure, were bending upward together. Resource management strategies that had worked for centuries were suddenly less effective, not because anyone forgot how to build a terrace or observe a ritual, but because the background conditions had shifted. Living in that world, the signs would show up in small, personal ways. A planting hole that used to stay moist a week now dries in 3 days. A familiar wood-gathering route no longer yields enough, even if you walk it to the end. The place your grandparents hunted deer now mostly offers rabbits and stories. Repairs to terraces wash out again and again, no matter how carefully you rebuild. None of those alone tells you it's time to leave your city, but together, and stacked on top of years of thin harvests, they start to whisper that the land itself is giving you a verdict. Not that the world is ending, but that this particular balance, this combination of people, fields, forests and game, is stretched past what it can sustain. Under those conditions, the value of staying put changes. Fortifying your village, tightening social rules, doubling down on ritual may help for a while. They also signal something else, that life on that cliff edge has entered a new, more anxious phase, where fear and protection begin to shape daily decisions as much as hope and tradition. Which is where we turn next. If the land feels less forgiving, people start looking sideways at each other more often. Archaeologists see hints of that shift in the northern San Juan during the 1200s, and this is where the story gets both gripping and uncomfortable. Because mixed in with check dams and terraces and carefully laid out plazas, we also find evidence that people were worried about more than just the weather. Start with the most visceral evidence. Bones. At some late 13th century sites, human remains show clear signs of trauma. Skulls with healed fractures from earlier blows. Unhealed fractures, crushed faces, broken arms, shattered ribs that look like the result of blunt force impacts or projectiles. Cut marks on bones in places that aren't about ordinary butchering, across the upper arms, around joints, on vertebrae. In a few infamous sites, bones are broken and burned in ways that some researchers interpret as evidence of massacres, even cannibalism. Layer onto that burned architecture entire room blocks charred, Roofs collapsed while on fire. Storage rooms that went up with their contents still inside. Sometimes burned structures contain scattered human remains that don't look like formal burials. Someone died there. Someone torched the place. The fire got hot enough to bake the adobe plaster and warp the stone. Then there are the sites themselves, where they sit on the land. Earlier villages in the region often cluster along streams or on open terraces with easy access to fields and water. By the late 1200s, you start seeing more settlements tucked on narrow mesa promontories, ringed by cliffs or jammed into alcoves high in canyon walls. The great cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, the compact pueblos perched on steep ridges, the sites that look out across deep gorges with only one or two viable approaches, these have long been read as defensive. Put those three together, traumatized bones, burned villages, cliff-hugging towns, and you can see why a lot of early scholarship framed the end of the Mesa Verde world as a story of war. Raiding bands, massacres, communities under siege, a once peaceful people turning on one another as drought tightened its grip. But each of those lines of evidence comes with caveats, and how we talk about them matters. Human remains with trauma absolutely demonstrate that violence occurred. The question is scale, frequency, and meaning. A broken skull can come from a club, a fall, or a rock fall in a collapsed kiva. Cut marks can be about post-mortem body handling, which in many cultures is ritual, not murder. Bones burned in a structure fire might have been inside when a house was deliberately burned as part of abandonment, not as part of an attack. Some sites do seem particularly grim. At a few, there are enough individuals with perimortem trauma, injuries at or near the time of death, to suggest single violent episodes involving multiple victims. But even these are debated. Are they massacres, executions, retaliatory killings, or something wrapped in ritual that doesn't fit neatly into modern categories? Burned pueblos don't automatically equal enemy attack either. In many parts of the world, people burn their own houses when they leave them, to cleanse, to close a chapter, to keep pests and scavengers out. Intentional burning during planned abandonment can leave very similar archaeological signatures to burning during conflict. The pattern matters. If you see uniform, controlled burning across a site with neatly cleaned out rooms, that leans one way. If you see chaotic burning, scattered valuables, and bodies in doorways, that leans another. Even defensive site is more complicated than it sounds. Yes, building in a cliff alcove where you can pull up ladders makes it harder for attackers to reach you. It also makes it harder for your toddlers to wander into the fields, or for livestock to stray, or for trash to accumulate right outside your doors. An inward-facing, compact pueblo can help with heat retention in winter and shade in summer. Thick walls and a single entrance work against wind as well as enemies. High vantage points are as useful for watching storm clouds and travellers as they are for spotting raiding parties. This is why interpreting violence in the archaeological record is so thorny, and why it's ethically sensitive. The descendants of the people who built these places are still here. Modern Pueblo nations don't need outside narratives casting their ancestors as warrior tribes, or just as problematically as naive victims. Stories of cannibalism and savagery have historically been used to justify land seizure and cultural erasure. When you label a whole culture's final century as a bloodbath based on a handful of sites, you're not just talking about the past. You're reinforcing stereotypes in the present. So many archaeologists today are more cautious. They don't deny violence. Humans are fully capable of hurting each other, and no society is exempt. But they try to separate what the data show from the stories we're tempted to tell. They ask, are we seeing endemic warfare, occasional raiding, ritualized conflict, or episodic catastrophes layered on top of other stresses? Are we projecting modern ideas of war onto a very different social landscape? That said, even if full-scale warfare wasn't constant, the architecture and settlement patterns still tell us something crucial. People felt insecure. Take the cliff dwellings again. Imagine living there. Every trip to your fields involves a climb, down ladders, along ledges, across talus. Every waterhaul from a spring at canyon bottom means carrying heavy jars up steep paths. Visiting your neighbours on the next mesa over is a commitment, not a casual stroll. Building in these spots isn't convenient. You accept daily inconvenience because you value something more, control over access. Defensive architecture doesn't have to mean pitched battles. It can be about managing risk from small, fast raids. A band of a dozen people with bad intentions can wreck stored food, steal animals, or grab children in minutes. If your houses are tucked into a narrow cleft with only one approach, you reduce the number of directions trouble can come from. You create choke points where a small number of defenders can hold off a larger force. You increase the odds that anyone approaching is seen, heard, vetted. There's also a social signalling side to this. A big stone pueblo perched dramatically on a cliff sends a message. This place is organised. This place can mobilise labour. This place is watching. In a landscape where groups are negotiating access to water, to hunting grounds, to sacred sites, that kind of statement matters. Being visibly defensible can deter conflict by making it clear that you're not an easy target, and that you have friends. But the cost of building your life around fear and fortification is that it reshapes everything else. Travel becomes less spontaneous and more strategic. You don't just wander over the next ridge alone. You go in groups at certain times, maybe on well-established trails with shrines or markers. That's partly practical navigation and ritual practice, but it's also security management. You want to be predictable to your allies and unpredictable to your enemies. Trade, which once might have been a relatively open-ended web of exchanges, turquoise moving one way, shells another, stories and marriage partners flowing along with them, tightens. If you're worried about raids, you may restrict who from your community is allowed to travel, or which outsiders can sleep inside your walls. Long-distance trade partners might still visit, but maybe under more formalized protections, specific times in the ritual calendar, specific hosts, specific obligations. The flow of goods can continue while the flow of people narrows. Even fieldwork and water access need new choreography. Fields near your village are one thing. Outlying plots, the ones on marginal soils that people pushed into in the last section, are another. Working those may now require watchfulness. Someone keeping an eye on the horizon, kids kept closer, perhaps tools cached so you can flee quickly. Springs and seeps that were once shared gathering spots become more fraught. Who else might show up? Are they kin, trading partners, rivals, refugees? In this kind of world, risk is unevenly distributed. Young men sent on hunting or trading trips shoulder one kind of danger. Women hauling water or tending fields shoulder another. Elders who can't move as easily may be more vulnerable during any sudden crisis. Communities might respond by creating new roles, scouts, guards, ritual specialists whose job is to maintain relations with neighbouring groups so that everyone has fewer reasons to fight. All of that, fortified sites, anxious travel, guarded springs, can emerge even in a setting where actual physical clashes are relatively infrequent. It's the perception of risk, not just the number of violent incidents, that drives behaviour. If you hear that a village 2 canyons over was attacked, you change your habits, whether or not you ever see an enemy yourself. Now fold that back into drought. Thin soils, distant forests and stretched hunting grounds. If your harvest is uncertain and your woodlot is far, you depend more heavily on stored food, stored fuel, stored goodwill with your neighbours. Those stores make you wealthier in a certain sense, and therefore more attractive targets in another. Conflict, or even the threat of it, makes you stash more, which makes you more tempting to raid. It's a feedback loop. Tightening security also makes adaptation harder. In easier times, if your fields fail, you might go spend a season helping kin in another valley, or marry into a group with better water, or move your household to follow game. In a tense, fortified landscape, movement is suspect. Showing up unannounced at someone else's spring is now potentially provocative. Trying to plant in a new place could be read as encroachment rather than cooperation. So conflict, whether actual or anticipated, doesn't have to be the main cause of regional abandonment to be crucial. It acts like an accelerant poured onto a pile of already smouldering problems. Drought eats into surplus. Soil loss makes recovery slower. Forest distance raises the cost of staying warm. Under those conditions, even small acts of violence, a burned field here, a stolen cache of corn there, a murdered hunter who doesn't come home, carry outsized consequences. A community that might have muddled through another lean year finds itself without the buffer it counted on. Fear pushes people to cluster more tightly, to abandon outlying hamlets, to consolidate into fewer, larger, more defensible centres. That concentration strains local resources further, making the next bad year worse. From the outside, centuries later, it's tempting to write a simple script. They started fighting, and everything fell apart. The reality that emerges from the ground is messier, and, in a way, more human. People responded to insecurity with creativity as well as suspicion. They built stunning, sophisticated settlements in improbable places. They wove social rules and ritual obligations around travel and exchange to keep interactions manageable. They tried to live with both danger and obligation in the same small canyons. But there is a point where layering more watchtowers, more walls, more rules onto a stressed landscape doesn't restore stability. It just makes the system more rigid. At that point, leaving may begin to look less like defeat and more like the only flexible move left. And if you're going to walk away from stone cities and cliff palaces that your grandparents raised, you don't do it for one reason. You do it in a web of reasons: water, soil, wood, game, fear, hope, memory, all knotted together. Part of that knot is belief, how you understand what's happening, what the land and the ancestors and the spirits demand in a time of strain. To follow the decision to abandon into its deepest layers, we have to step into that realm next. If you lived in those canyons in the late 1200s, your world wouldn't just be fields and walls and watch points. It would be structured, down to the day, down to the hour, by ceremonies. The landscape was mapped in stories: springs, rock formations, distant peaks, all of them tied into origin narratives and migration paths. Villages weren't just where the water and soil were. They were where the stories said people should be. At the centre of that lived religion were kivas and plazas. A kiva is not just a meeting room. It's an opening to the underworld, a place where people emerge and return in ritual. The sipapu, a small hole or mark spot in the floor, symbolises the place of emergence. The benches, niches, hearth, ventilator, deflector stones, all of it laid out in a pattern that repeated from village to village with local variations. In the big canyon pueblos, you didn't just have one kiva, you had many. Small, family-scale kivas, and then great kivas, massive, often isolated circular structures big enough for large gatherings. These weren't casual add-ons. Excavating and lining a kiva, roofing it with heavy beams, keeping it maintained, took serious labour and coordination. You build that because you need it. And the plazas, the open courtyards framed by room blocks, were stages for group life. Dances, feasts, markets, diplomatic visits, initiation ceremonies, public parts of rites that also had secret components inside kivas. The year turned not by a wall calendar, but by what was happening in those spaces: planting dances, solstice observances, dedications, rites of rain and fertility. All of this ran on a ritual calendar tuned to the sky. We know from descendant Pueblo communities that ritual specialists track the sun's position on the horizon, the phases of the moon, sometimes the appearance of key stars. Shadow markers on cliff faces and room corners could have functioned as observatories. At Chaco Canyon, long before the Mesa Verde exodus, alignments and sightlines seemed to tie architecture directly to solstices and lunar standstills. In the 1200s, that legacy doesn't just vanish. People in the northern San Juan almost certainly had specialists, priests, astronomer farmers, ritual leaders, whose job it was to know where they were in sacred time and to coordinate ceremonies accordingly. That calendar did more than please the gods. It synchronized people. If everyone in the village knows that at midwinter you'll gather in the plaza to dance, that the kivas will be busy for days beforehand, that visitors from allied communities will arrive, then your labour and your emotions and your expectations all orbit shared events. Ritual pulls scattered households into one social rhythm. It tells you when to plant, when to travel, when to fast, when to feast, when to welcome strangers, when to shut the doors. Under stress, that system can hold people together, or it can begin to crack. Think about what happens when drought stretches from one bad year into a string of them. You do the rain ceremonies, you fast, you offer, you dance, you keep the fires and the songs going because that is what has always helped. When the clouds still don't come, the question becomes unavoidable. Is the problem us, or the rites, or the leaders? Archaeologically, you can't dig up a crisis of faith directly, but you can see its shadows. One line of evidence is in how kivas are used, and stopped being used. At some late sites, kivas are carefully cleaned and ritually closed. Sipapu sealed, hearths emptied, roof beams removed, sometimes offerings placed and plastered over. That looks like an orderly ending, a conscious termination of sacred space. At others, you find kivas chopped through, used as trash pits, cut by later walls. That suggests a change in meaning. A place that was once central becomes marginal, even reversed. You can also see shifts in scale. Earlier villages might have a few sizable kivas serving multiple households. Later, you sometimes see an explosion of small kivas or special-purpose rooms, as if rituals were fragmenting into many little circles rather than a few big ones. Or the opposite, smaller kivas fall out of use while a single great kiva or plaza dominates the site plan, hinting at authority coalescing into fewer hands. Changes in iconography, painted designs on plaster, patterns on pottery, carved or pecked imagery on rock, are another proxy. New motifs appearing quickly over a broad region might signal a new ritual cult or a new emphasis in belief. Conversely, the abrupt disappearance of once common symbols could mean that certain stories, clans, or ceremonial societies lost influence, either peacefully or under pressure. All of this comes back to power. In a world where there are no written laws and no standing army, religious specialists and ritual knowledge carry enormous weight. Knowing the right songs, the right days, the right offerings, the right stories of origin, these are not just spiritual secrets, they are political resources. Many archaeologists think that in the centuries before the 1200s, some parts of the ancestral Pueblo world saw increasing centralization of this kind of authority. Great houses aligned to celestial events, oversized kivas, road systems connecting outlying sites to central places like Chaco suggest that certain lineages or priesthoods could coordinate labor at a regional scale. Later, as the Chaco system waned, other centers rose, Aztec ruins to the north, for example, or pueblos in the Mesa Verde region itself. By the time the final droughts hit, leadership was probably already contested. Who gets to say when to plant, when to hold rain rites, when to send emissaries for corn or marriage partners? Whose ceremonial calendar prevails when neighbouring communities' schedules don't match? If you've built your legitimacy on maintaining balance with the non-human world, and that balance is visibly fraying, your authority is undercut. Under those conditions, collective decision-making can fracture. One path is hardening hierarchy. A shrinking surplus might push leaders to claim more control, over storage rooms, over the timing of distributions, over who gets access to key rituals. You could see more restricted spaces, doorless upper stories accessed by ladders, storage areas deep inside room blocks, kivas with limited entrances. Restricted access often maps onto restricted information and restricted authority. Another path is dispersal of power. Households might begin relying more on their own shrines and family ceremonies, rather than big community rites. Decisions about planting, migration or alliance could shift from plaza councils to smaller, more flexible gatherings. From the ground, this might look like variability in architecture within the same village. Clustering of some families into tight compounds, others more loosely affiliated, different styles of ritual rooms tucked into corners. Neither path is inherently peaceful. Tightening hierarchy can trigger resistance. Decentralization can create factionalism. If some groups align themselves with one set of rituals and leaders, and others with a competing set, you begin to get ideological fault lines layered on top of resource tensions. And that's where pull factors enter the picture. It's tempting to think only in terms of what pushed people out of Mesa Verde country: drought, soil loss, fear. But across the broader southwest, other places were flourishing, or at least holding on. The Rio Grande Valley, the Mogollon Rim country, the Zuni area, parts of what is now eastern Arizona and western New Mexico. These regions show evidence of growing populations in the 1200s and 1300s. They weren't just attractive because they had water and arable land. They were attractive because they had their own sacred geographies, their own emerging centres. Imagine hearing, through trade partners or marriage ties, that far to the south there is a Pueblo whose kiva fires never go out, where the ceremonies are powerful, where the springs still flow, or that there is a place closer to the sunrise that figures in your own migration stories, a place your ancestors once passed through and promised someday to return to. In traditions across the Pueblo world, migration is not a random wandering. It is a fulfillment of obligations laid down in mythic time. From that perspective, leaving a beloved but failing homeland could be framed not as collapse, but as renewal. Archaeologically, this shows up as convergence. Pottery styles, architectural forms, and ritual features from the Mesa Verde region begin appearing in faraway valleys. At the same time, local traditions in those destination regions continue. The result is hybrid communities, kivas with design elements from multiple areas, plazas used in ways that blend practices, room blocks laid out in new configurations that nevertheless echo older patterns. That pattern suggests that migrants were welcomed, or at least negotiated entry, into existing ritual systems. They didn't arrive as blank slates. They brought their own sacred bundles, their own songs, their own calendars. Integrating those into new alliances would have required ceremony upon ceremony, adoption rites, shared dances, reciprocal feasts, the careful weaving of origin stories so that your ancestors and our ancestors could become the ancestors. From the perspective of people making the decision, the choice might have sounded less like, we must flee, and more like, it is time. Time to complete a prophesied circuit. Time to seek out the place where the sun rises between particular peaks on solstice morning, matching the descriptions in sacred narratives. Time to join kin whose altars hold missing pieces of your ceremonial cycle. Time to move toward a polity where your children will be plugged into a stronger, more stable ritual network. Even the act of abandonment itself could be sacralized. Closing kivas carefully, depositing offerings in doorways, burning selected rooms, these can all be understood as ritual acts of release. You don't just walk away and leave your spirit ties dangling. You untie them through ceremony. You kill the house so that its essence can travel with you, or so that it will not be misused by others. You feed the place one last time. For descendants, this matters. Many modern Pueblo origin stories don't talk about their ancestors losing Mesa Verde or Chaco or other ancestral homelands. They talk about moving through them, stopping for a while, learning certain things, then moving on when the time and the signs indicated. Difficult decisions, yes. Sometimes the stories remember hunger, conflict, hard winters. But the overarching narrative is one of guided movement, not senseless scatter. Seen that way, the social changes of the 1200s, the contested leadership, the splintering and recombining of ritual practice, the magnetic pull of new centres to the south and east, aren't just symptoms of breakdown. They're the mechanisms through which a society reconfigures itself at continental scale. From a distant vantage point centuries later, it can look abrupt. Big kivas go cold. Plazas fall silent. Cliff dwellings echo. But at the level of lived experience, people may have felt not only fear and loss, but also purpose. Leaving those canyons could be imagined as stepping back into the migration path that had always defined who they were. Of course, imagining new places of promise, new alliances, and new sacred obligations is one thing. Getting there, across rugged mesas, through contested territories, with children and elders and stored seed corn is another. To see how that worked, and how those pull factors were connected by real paths across the land, we have to zoom out again to the networks that tied all these communities together. That web is where the next part of the story unfolds. Long before anyone packed up a room in Cliff Palace, Those canyons were already plugged into a continent-scale web. If you were standing in a Mesa Verde plaza in, say, 1250, and you looked around at the things people actually used, very little of it would be purely local. The pots you cooked in and stored grain in. Some would be made right there from nearby clay, but others, maybe the ones with particularly fine black-on-white designs, or the ones with red slip and white decorations in a style your grandmother said came from far to the south, those travelled. Clay from one valley, temper from another, painted in a design tradition from yet another. The pot itself might have changed hands 3 or 4 times before it ever reached your hearth. Passed along as a gift, a bride wealth item, a payment for labour, a ritual offering converted into a usable object. Then there was turquoise. Bright blue-green nodules, drilled and ground into beads, inlaid into pendants, stitched onto clothing, tied into hair. We know from chemical analysis that a lot of the turquoise found in big centres like Chaco didn't come from right next door. It came from multiple mining districts scattered across what is now the southwest. By the 1200s, that tradition of moving turquoise around the landscape hadn't vanished. People in the northern San Juan were still part of that exchange sphere, moving stones that carried not just material value but spiritual significance. Turquoise wasn't just pretty. It was tied into ideas about water, sky, fertility, and power. And then there were the things that clearly weren't from around here. Macaws, bright tropical parrots from hundreds of miles to the south, from what is now northern Mexico. Archaeologists have found their bones and sometimes their feathers in ancestral Pueblo sites, including in the centuries leading up to abandonment. Keeping a macaw alive that far north isn't trivial. You need to feed it, shelter it, incorporate it into ritual. That means the bird isn't just a curiosity, it's a node in a live relationship stretching across deserts and mountain ranges. Salt, too, moved along these paths. Certain springs and deposits were famous sources. People travelled to them, sometimes on dedicated pilgrimages, sometimes as part of mixed trading ventures. Salt is a basic dietary need, but it's also a ritual substance, for purification, for sealing agreements, for offerings. A community cut off from reliable salt isn't just nutritionally stressed, it's ceremonially impaired. And of course, food itself travelled. Not usually in bulk, the way later empires would move grain by the ton, but surpluses could still flow along kinship and exchange networks. A village that had a decent harvest might host feasts and send guests home with baskets of corn or squash. A community that specialised in certain crops or processing techniques, better dried meat, better parched corn, better ground flour, could turn that into leverage and obligation. When your own fields failed, you didn't automatically starve. You sent runners and messengers along the routes your ancestors had used, calling in favours, renewing ties, asking allies to share. Under good conditions, this web of exchange did something remarkable. It smoothed out the bumps. If one valley had a bad year, a well-functioning network could buffer it with resources from somewhere less affected. If one centre's ritual calendar called for a big event, trade and gift exchange around that event could redistribute material and social capital. Pottery, turquoise, macaws, salt, food, and the ideas and stories attached to them were all ways of moving stability around. But that same complexity made the system fragile. Because it wasn't just corn and parrot feathers riding those trails, legitimacy was too. Leaders, whether we call them chiefs, headmen, priests, or something more fluid, drew part of their authority from being able to orchestrate connections. If you can guarantee that visiting traders will show up for your solstice ceremony, that exotic goods will arrive on schedule, that people from 3 or 4 regions will gather in your plaza to dance and feast, then you're not just coordinating ritual, you're proving that the world works through you. Now imagine what happens when the world stops cooperating. Extended droughts in the late 1200s didn't just reduce yields in one canyon. Tree ring studies show broad regional patterns of low rainfall and short growing seasons. If many communities are under stress at the same time, that smoothing function of trade starts to break down. Your partners who once sent you surplus corn may no longer have any to spare. The salt expedition you planned gets ambushed or turned away because the people at the salt source are themselves on edge. The trader who would normally bring macaws or shell from the south doesn't arrive this year or the next. From the outside, that looks like a disruption in goods. From inside the society, it looks like cracks in meaning. If your authority depends partly on being the kind of leader whose alliances hold, whose ritual obligations are reciprocated, and whose big gatherings are well supplied, then each failed caravan, each missed feast, each undelivered promise chips away at your position. People start to ask, why didn't our neighbours send food? Did we offend them? Did you mismanage that relationship? Are our ceremonies no longer effective? Are the stories that tied us to that salt spring still valid? Or have we strayed from the proper path? The archaeology hints that interaction spheres, the geographic zones within which people regularly exchange goods, marriage partners and ritual knowledge, were changing right around the time Mesa Verde was abandoned. Earlier in the ancestral Pueblo story, you see broad stylistic unities, pottery types, architectural layouts, ritual forms that spread across huge areas from Chaco to the edges of the Colorado Plateau. Those patterns suggest wide integrated networks. By the 1200s and 1300s, things look more fragmented and reconfigured. Some regions that had once shared styles diverge. Others, especially to the south and east, the Rio Grande, the Zuni area, the Mogollon Rim, start showing convergences, hybrid pottery designs, mixed architectural features, new combinations of ritual spaces. It looks as if the map of who was connected to whom was being redrawn. One way to see this is as collapse, a big centralized system like Chaco's giving way to a more fractured landscape of smaller competing networks. But you can also see it as migration playing out along pre-existing lines. People don't move randomly. They move along threads they already know. If your aunt married into a village 2 weeks' travel away, if your clan has a ritual obligation at a shrine in a distant valley, if traders regularly pass through carrying news of a river where the crops still do well, those become your options. When a household or a faction decides to leave, they almost never head off into a blank unknown. They set their feet on paths that have been worn by centuries of exchange. You can imagine a sequence like this. First, bad years. Then tense conversations in kivas and plazas about whether to stay or go. Meanwhile, traders arrive from the south with stories. Yes, the drought is bad, but the river valleys still have some flow. Yes, there's conflict here and there, but certain pueblos are growing, building new room blocks, adding kivas. Maybe they even bring back new ritual knowledge, new painted designs, new songs that are starting to gain traction. As trust in local leadership erodes, and as big regional integrators like Chaco have long since lost their central grip, those alternative centres become more attractive, not just spiritually, as we talked about in the previous section, but logistically. They're reachable. Your cousins are there, your pottery already circulates in their markets, you know which springs you can camp near on the way because generations of salt and turquoise caravans have mapped the stops. In that sense, migration is less a desperate leap, and more a reorientation of the existing network. When enough households make that choice, though, the network can tip quickly. Think about intervillage trust as a kind of currency. You trust that your neighbours will welcome you to their plaza during ceremony, that they won't raid your fields when your young men are away on a trading trip, that they'll honour old agreements about water and hunting grounds. But under stress, when corn is short, when rumours of raids trickle in, when stories circulate that some community failed to reciprocate a feast or misused a sacred object, that trust can evaporate fast. Archaeological hints of palisades, defensive ditches, arrow points embedded in bones or plastered walls, burned room blocks. All of these suggest that, in some pockets, violence spiked in the late 1200s. That doesn't mean everyone was at war with everyone. It means enough incidents occurred to change how people saw their neighbours. One raid, real or rumoured, might cause a village to cancel a planned trade fair. Another might lead people to wall off an open plaza, to station lookouts, to stop sending their children to distant relatives for extended visits. Suddenly, the routes that once moved salt and macaws and marriage partners are seen as dangerous. Messengers are suspected of being scouts. Strangers at the spring are no longer automatically guests, they're potential threats. As trust retracts, so does the network's ability to buffer crisis. Your world starts to shrink. Instead of drawing on partners 3 or 4 valleys away, you rely on the few communities you still believe won't attack you. If those two begin to wobble, if they're also under stress, also losing confidence in the old arrangements, then the safety net tears. That's when regional change can accelerate dramatically. One year, you have a laced-together landscape of dozens of pueblos, all tied into overlapping exchange circuits. A decade or two later, if enough households have left along those same circuits for the Rio Grande or the Zuni heartland, if enough relationships have soured, if enough routes have become perilous, you can end up with entire districts effectively hollowed out. From a distant vantage point centuries later, it looks like disappearance. In reality, it's what happens when a network system crosses certain thresholds. Trade and ritual exchange are amazing at spreading resilience until the conditions that support trust and reciprocity falter. Then those same pathways can carry fear, rumour, and opportunity elsewhere. They become exit ramps as much as lifelines. The story of Mesa Verde's abandonment isn't just about people leaving isolated cliff dwellings. It's about families and factions making decisions inside a web of obligations and options that spanned hundreds of miles. Their routes out were the same roads and trails that had once brought them turquoise and parrots and news of distant ceremonies. To understand why those roads filled with migrants and why some canyons emptied while others swelled, we need to look at the physical traces of those paths themselves, the engineered landscapes of movement that still score the mesas. Those roads hold clues to how quickly a region can go from densely inhabited to eerily quiet without anyone ever truly vanishing. From the vantage point of the 21st century, the whole thing has a jump-cut feel. One chapter of the story shows plazas full of people, smoke curling from rooftop holes, corn drying on racks, roads buzzing with travellers. Turn the page in the archaeological record and suddenly, silence. No fresh trash, no new construction, no one home. That's where the myth of a people vanishing overnight is born. But part of that illusion comes from the particular fingerprints that abandonment leaves behind. What archaeologists sometimes call abandonment signatures. When people live in a place, they produce a very specific background noise. They break pots and don't bother to sweep up every shard. They patch roofs that leak, replaster walls that crack, toss ash from yesterday's fire into middens that rise layer by layer just outside the door. Burial grounds slowly fill. Hearths get rebuilt, moved, expanded. It's messy, continuous, almost invisible when you're inside it. When people leave, that noise changes character in ways that are surprisingly consistent. Walk through a once bustling cliff dwelling that's been carefully excavated, and you start to see a strange pattern. Rooms where things look like they were mid-use and then stopped. Walls that were half replastered, with old plaster scraped off and new mud only partly smoothed on. Grinding stones left with a thin film of meal still in the depressions. Construction projects, a new kiva bench, a room addition, an unfinished storage niche that were started but never completed. In some rooms you find good, serviceable tools left behind. Manos and metats, big storage jars, baskets in various stages of decay. Not scattered randomly as if looters had overturned everything, but sitting where someone last set them down. Other spaces tell a different story. Doors intentionally sealed with stone and adobe. Storage rooms that were carefully closed off, sometimes with large jars still inside, sometimes empty but ritually finished with offerings. Corn cobs, broken pots, a sprinkling of ash. To a modern eye, that mix looks contradictory. Was the departure chaotic, with work abandoned midstream? Or was it thoughtful, with rooms ceremonially closed? The answer is almost certainly both, depending on who you were, what season it was, and how many chances you expected to get to come back. Because here's another thing that can make abandonment look dramatic. Timing. Agricultural people in harsh environments are seasonal movers by default. Even in good years, families and segments of families move in and out of their main pueblos. They go to field houses at planting time, to higher ground in summer for hunting or foraging, to distant shrines or relatives' villages at certain ritual moments. If you'd walked into Mesa Verde in, say, late winter during much of its occupation, you might have found stretches of cliff community eerily quiet. Many people would be in the lowlands, tending winter fields or staying closer to unfrozen water. The architecture doesn't breathe in a steady rhythm, it pulses. Now imagine that pattern stretched out, distorted by drought and fear and new opportunities elsewhere. A household might leave for the season, with every intention of coming back after the next round of ceremonies, after testing a new valley, after checking in on kin to the south. They take the obvious portable valuables, good blankets, favourite tools, treasured ornaments, maybe a sacred bundle that belongs to their lineage. They leave behind the heavy stuff, big grinding slabs, bulky jars set deep into bins in the floor. Why haul £100 stone if you think you'll be back before long? But the season goes badly. The crops fail again. Word comes that another village in the next canyon has packed up for the Rio Grande. Maybe there's news of a raid that hit close to home. Maybe the people you were depending on for ritual support don't show. When the time comes that you would normally head back up to the cliffs, you don't. Multiply that hesitation, postponed return, extended stay elsewhere, by dozens of households making similar decisions on slightly different schedules, and a seasonal ebb and flow can tip into permanent abandonment without a single smoky line of refugees snaking out of the canyons all at once. From an archaeological perspective, though, we don't see the hesitation. We see the empty rooms. What stays and what goes in those rooms adds another layer to the illusion of suddenness. People don't distribute their belongings randomly on departure. They triage, according to a logic shaped by portability, need, taboo, and how they understand their own future. Things you can carry easily and that you can't easily remake. Metal tools in later societies, but here, finely made ritual items, good knives, portable grinding manos, clothing, jewellery. Those are high on the list. So are things that anchor your social identity. Clan symbols, prayer sticks, masks, bundles. Leave those, and it's not just property you're abandoning, it's status and belonging. Bulky but still valuable items occupy a more ambiguous zone. A big storage jar, especially if it's full of grain, is a serious investment. But if you're moving on foot, with children and old people, through uncertain country, you're not going to put a clay jar on your back for days. Some families may have cached such items along the way or stashed them in out-of-the-way rock shelters, hoping to return. Others may have made offerings of them, smashing a pot as part of a closing ritual rather than lugging it off. And then there are things you don't take, not because they're useless, but because you're not supposed to. Certain rooms and objects have a weight that's more spiritual than practical. A kiva that has seen generations of ceremony, a shrine niche, a burial cluster. Destroying those or prying loose everything of value from them might be seen as inviting misfortune. Better to leave them with the proper closing gestures, scattering cornmeal, placing a token offering, sealing an entrance, than to strip them bare. When archaeologists find, for instance, a room sealed with a neat plug of masonry, with the floor swept clean and a few objects clearly arranged with intent, that doesn't scream panic. It suggests a planned departure, framed as an ending that had to be marked correctly. In the same site, a different room might contain toppled jars, ash left in place, tools dropped near the hearth. Maybe that household left under duress. Maybe they meant to come back in a few days and never could. Maybe someone died suddenly, and their relatives vacated the room without going through the full closure ritual. Across a whole community, these individual stories blend into a general signature. Fewer hearths show the charcoal of recent use. Fewer walls are patched. Fewer roofs are rebuilt. Trash layers thin and stop. Burials in local cemeteries dwindle and end. That's what scholars mean when they talk about silent cities. It's not that the stones themselves are speaking in some mystical way. It's that all the mundane indicators of life fall quiet. You can trace it stratigraphically. Earlier layers show constant fiddling. New post holes cut through old plaster, successive floors laid down over each other, discarded maize cobs and broken pots building up in corners. Then, near the top, the activity tails off. Rooms that used to be cleaned regularly are allowed to accumulate dust. Roof timbers rot and fall without anyone clearing them. The last few hearths are small, they're ash-thin, as if fewer people are cooking. Even the dead move elsewhere. In many ancestral Pueblo communities, people buried their relatives nearby, under room floors, in courtyards, in dedicated cemeteries. As departure nears, those burials decline. Bodies show up instead in regions that will later be known as Zuni, Acoma, or the Rio Grande Pueblos. The silent site isn't where people stopped living, it's where they stopped dying. From far away in time, this pattern can look like an abrupt switch. There's occupation, then there isn't. Our minds want to fill in that gap with something equally abrupt. A massacre, a plague, a mysterious disappearance. And once a dramatic story like that takes hold, it tends to stick. By the time Euro-American explorers and surveyors started stumbling across cliff dwellings in the 19th century, the people who built them had long since woven their own migrations into origin stories, clan histories, and sacred narratives. Those aren't meant to be read like GPS logs. They compress generations into mythic episodes, attach movements to moral lessons, frame departure as obedience to spiritual instruction, rather than reaction to soil depletion or trade breakdown. Colonial chroniclers, missionaries, and later popular writers heard snippets of those stories. We came from the north. Our ancestors once lived in cliff houses, and often interpreted the empty stone villages through their own lenses. Lost tribes, vanishing races, ghost peoples. Add in the eerie preservation of some cliff sites, walls still standing, plaster still faintly painted, pots still sitting on ledges, and it becomes easy to conjure scenes of sudden flight. It looks to an untrained eye as if someone stepped out for a moment and never came back. What's missing in that picture is the slow, messy, overlapping reality. Decades of hard choices, partial moves, seasonal absences that quietly turned into permanent ones, ritual closures stretched out over years. A region can lose most of its resident population in a few human lifetimes, without any single night of catastrophe. That's fast enough that, in oral tradition, it can feel like a single turning. Fast enough that, in the archaeological record, it looks like a sharp drop rather than a long slope. Fast enough that later outsiders, looking at the stones and not knowing the routes out, reach for the language of disappearance. But if you follow those routes, the story reads differently. The same centuries that see hearths go cold in Mesa Verde show new hearths lighting up along the Rio Grande and in other river valleys to the south. Architectural styles, pottery designs, ritual features that had been common in the northern San Juan reappear in those emerging pueblos, blended with local traditions into new forms. The supposed vanishing is really a redistribution. To understand that shift, you have to step out of the canyons and onto the trails themselves, the roads and paths that carried households away, and the new places where those travellers turned empty stone villages into remembered homelands, rather than ruins of a lost people. If you zoom out from any one canyon and look at a map of the whole northern southwest, a different pattern starts to emerge. Those silent cities are not isolated. They sit at the northern end of a web. Some of that web is literal. On the ground, you can still trace segments of engineered roadways built centuries before the big departures, straight, wide, sometimes cut or levelled through rough terrain in ways that go far beyond casual footpaths, out from Chaco, down off the mesas, across the desert flats. Not all of those roads point toward the places people eventually went, but they show you something crucial. This was never a world of self-contained canyons. It was a landscape already laced with movement. By the late 1200s, when the last large communities in places like Mesa Verde, Cayenta, and the northern San Juan were thinning out, that movement seems to focus south and east along a few broad corridors, follow drainages and traversable passes, and certain routes almost choose themselves. From the Four Corners highlands, you can move down the San Juan and then cut over into the Chama and Rio Grande valleys. From the Cayenta region, you can angle south and east toward the Hopi Mesas. From the central Mesa Verde area, you can drop off the cliffs, cross through what's now northwestern New Mexico, and pick up the Rio Puerco and other feeders that lead, step by step, into the Rio Grande Basin. Archaeologists don't see caravans preserved in stone. What they see are fingerprints of continuity. Pottery styles distinctive to the Mesa Verde region, particular painted designs, rim forms, ways of finishing the clay, start showing up more often in assemblages hundreds of kilometres away. Kiva forms that were common in the north, certain floor grooves, bench arrangements, ventilator systems, appear suddenly in new villages along the middle Rio Grande. At Hopi, oral histories speak of clans arriving from the north, bringing specific rituals and symbols that get woven into Hopi society. Put that material trail together with those stories, and it becomes possible to sketch the broad roads out of the canyons. Not precise GPS lines, but bands of movement carrying people toward the Rio Grande Valley, the Zuni region, the Hopi Mesas, and other river systems to the south. Now imagine walking those roads, not as an abstract arrow on a map, but as one of the families that had to use them. You're not a lone adult traveller. You're likely part of a multi-generational household, or a cluster of related households moving together. Among you are small children who can walk only some of the day, older people whose knees have already felt a lifetime of ladder-climbing pregnant women, maybe someone recovering from illness. On top of that, you're not just moving people, you're moving a future. That means seed. You can't count on wherever you end up having the varieties of corn, beans and squash. Your people know how to grow in the exact combinations that fit your planting songs, your altars, your storage systems. So someone is responsible for a small but vital cargo. Deerskin bags of carefully selected seed, ears of maize chosen from the last decent harvest, perhaps small packets of amaranth or other grains. These aren't just groceries, they're continuity. Plant them, and you're binding the new place back to the old in a very literal way. It also means tools. You don't drag every heavy stone with you, but you're not starting bare-handed. Portable grinding manos, good hammer stones, prize stone blades, bone awls, needles, things that took skilled labour to make and can't be easily replicated if you arrive in a place with poor raw materials, go into bundles. So do the things that let you make things, the knowledge of which outcrops along the way have nappable stone, which patches of riverbank hold good clay, which plants make strong fibres, and it means ritual. In many Pueblo traditions, power and responsibility are tied to specific bundles, masks, prayer sticks, fetishes, objects that are not simply owned by individuals but held in trust by lineages or societies. Those don't stay in empty rooms, they travel, often with strict rules about who can touch them, how they must be wrapped, what songs accompany them. Alongside them travel stories about emergence, migrations, clan wanderings, that already frame movement as part of who you are. Leaving Mesa Verde or any other canyon isn't just a logistical decision, it's an episode in a longer sacred history that says, over and over, we came from somewhere else, and we were told at some point to move on. But even with all that cultural scaffolding, the act of actually stepping away is not clean. The road out of one canyon is rarely a straight shot to a permanent new home. It's more like a series of tests. You move to a nearby valley first, maybe to reoccupy an older field area, or join relatives who left a few years earlier. You plant there for a season or two. If the rains cooperate, if the soil seems kind, if relations with neighbours are manageable, maybe this becomes the place. You reinforce the walls on an old room, dig new storage pits, start thinking about kiva locations. If things go badly, if the wells go brackish, if frost kills the corn, if there are disputes over water with people upstream, you shift again. From the perspective of a single life, this might feel chaotic. A string of provisional homes, each one promising to be the last move, each one turning out to be just another way station. From an archaeological perspective, it can look like a flutter. Small sites occupied briefly, with only a handful of rooms and a few hearths before being abandoned in turn. Across the broader region, those flutters sometimes coalesce. Groups leaving different canyons, often on slightly staggered schedules, may find themselves converging at certain attractive nodes, confluences of streams, well-watered river terraces, places with existing shrines or springs already woven into older ritual geographies. Here, you start to see reaggregation. A hamlet of a few rooms grows into a plaza village with dozens. Separate households that had been spread thin across marginal lands condense into denser communities along more reliable water sources. Architectural layouts shift to accommodate that density. Plazas get larger, room blocks more continuous, kivas more numerous. Socially, that's a major renegotiation. You're not just rebuilding architecture, you're rebuilding how you live with other people. Some of these new villages clearly include populations with mixed origins. You can see it in pottery assemblages that combine northern San Juan styles with older local types, in architectural features that blend design cues from several regions, in oral histories that remember the place as a meeting ground of multiple clans. How do migrants get to stay in such places? They don't simply show up, plunk down a house, and declare themselves residents. Access to water, fields, and timber is controlled, not as private property in the modern sense, but through webs of kinship, reciprocal obligation, and ritual authority. If you're arriving in a valley where people already live, your safest strategy is rarely conquest. It's relationship. Maybe you already have relatives there. Kin ties created generations earlier through marriage exchanges, trade partnerships, shared ceremonies. You bring gifts, food, cloth, perhaps a share of your remaining seed. You participate in their rituals, and if you carry your own bundles, you may offer to add your ceremonies to their calendar, enriching the village's ritual life in ways that can benefit everyone. In return, you're granted rights. Not abstract land titles, but responsibilities. To plant a certain stretch of terrace, to maintain a canal, to help re-roof a kiva, to patrol for danger on a particular ridge. With those duties comes the right to draw water from a ditch, to gather wood in a certain stand of pinyon or juniper, to plant under the protection of a particular shrine. Timber, in particular, is not an infinite resource in this world. In many canyon regions, earlier construction booms had already thinned nearby forests. Moving into new areas, you're negotiating not just for a place to build, but for the right to cut beams for those roofs, in some cases hauling them from farther and farther away. Those negotiations aren't always peaceful. Evidence from some late 13th century sites suggests episodes of conflict, burned buildings, people killed violently. But along the roads that succeeded, the more important story may be one of patient, sometimes tense integration. Clans from the north slowly becoming part of existing communities, or banding together with other migrants to found new ones along rivers that could sustain them. Underneath all the logistics, the seed bags, the tool bundles, the water rights, there's the emotional weight. Imagine being a child walking away from a cliff dwelling that has been the centre of your world, watching it shrink behind you as the trail bends, not knowing if you'll ever see it again. Imagine being an elder who helped replaster those kiva walls in your youth, now leaning on a stick as younger hands steady you on rough ground. Some people may be excited, seeing in the move the possibility of better fields, less hunger, a fresh start. Others are grieving long before the canyon falls out of sight. Those feelings don't leave traces in adobe. They don't fossilize in pottery shards. They surface instead in the myths and songs that later generations carried. Stories of hard journeys, of sacred springs discovered after long wanderings, of ancestors who had to leave places they loved because the spirits told them, or because they had broken a rule and had to seek balance elsewhere. Even hope is complicated. You might believe deeply that the move is guided, not just by environmental necessity, but by spiritual instruction, by signs read in the sky, in the behavior of animals, in the outcome of ceremonies. You might also know, from recent memory, that crops fail even in promising places, that raiders can appear without warning, that children get sick on the trail. So when you tie on your sandals, shoulder your share of the load, and step onto the road out of the canyon, you're carrying more than seed and stone. You're carrying a mix of fear and determination, loss and anticipation, memories of what you're leaving and imagined pictures of what might lie ahead, along the Rio Grande, on the Hopi mesas, in any place where someone will let you plant and pray. For the archaeologist looking back, all of that collapses into patterns on a map, sites going quiet in one cluster of canyons, new ones flaring up in river valleys to the south and east. For the people living it, those were not patterns. They were choices made under pressure, one footstep at a time, and as those footsteps converged along the big river corridors, up toward the isolated mesas, the migrants from the north did not simply disappear into a formless mass. They arrived with names, clans, ceremonies, and memories, all of which would be woven over generations into the identities of the pueblos that still stand today. That's where the story turns next. What happened after the roads out of the canyons ended, and how new homes and new identities grew from the grief and hope carried along those trails. Follow those roads to where many of them end, and the landscape looks different. The deep, tight sandstone canyons give way to broader river valleys and open basins. Instead of scattered cliff alcoves, you start seeing villages pulled close around plazas, built out on low rises above floodplains, or strung along irrigable terraces beside dependable streams. Archaeologists sometimes call these aggregated pueblos, because compared to the smaller hamlets and farmsteads of earlier centuries, they're big. Not city big by modern standards, but big for this world. Hundreds of rooms in multi-story blocks wrapped around one or more plazas, dozens of kivas instead of a handful. In some stretches of the middle Rio Grande, you can stand on one high point and see multiple large villages spaced along the river like beads on a string. This is the other side of the abandonment story. As the north thins out, some parts of the south and east thicken dramatically. Why? Part of it is simple arithmetic of survival. In a time of uncertainty, about climate, about raiding, about access to water, it's safer not to be isolated. If you live in a two-household hamlet on a marginal ridge and someone decides to take your stored corn, there isn't much you can do. If you live in a village with 200 households, that's a different equation. A bigger community can field more defenders, organize lookout systems, and maintain more robust social networks for mutual aid when crops fail. Water also pushes people together. In the northern San Juan and Mesa Verde regions, a lot of farming had depended on precipitation, planting in places where the soil could soak up enough seasonal rainfall, augmenting only minimally with small check dams or runoff features. In the Rio Grande Valley and other southern basins, people had long been experimenting with more structured control of water, diverting small streams, spreading floodwaters onto fields, digging and maintaining ditches. Those systems work best when many hands are available to dig, clear, repair, and patrol. They also work best when there are enough people to coordinate planting schedules, allocate turns, and resolve disputes. That kind of cooperation is easier if the people involved can literally shout to each other across the plaza instead of trekking miles between isolated farmsteads. So aggregation is partly about defense, partly about water, and partly about the efficiencies of cooperation when the margins are thin. But big villages are not just bigger versions of the old cliff communities. They're something socially new. In earlier centuries, a canyon settlement might be dominated by people whose families had been there for generations, sharing closely related histories. In these late 13th and early 14th century pueblos, you start seeing much more obvious mixing. You can see that in the clay. Take a trash mound from one of these big Rio Grande pueblos and sort the potsherds into piles. Some of them look like local wares that had been made there, or in nearby valleys, for centuries. Brown or grey utility jars with certain tempers and surface treatments. Painted bowls in established local designs. Mixed into that are sherds that look like they were carried in from afar. Classic Mesa Verde black-on-white bowls, for example, probably treasured and reused long after their original owners left the north. And then, crucially, you start finding new designs that blend elements of both. Local clays and firing techniques combined with paint layouts, motifs, or rim forms that echo northern traditions. You see it in architecture too. A village might have room blocks that follow long-standing local layouts alongside others that look more like transplanted northern blueprints. Kivas with features characteristic of the San Juan region, or multi-story room blocks arranged in ways reminiscent of Kayenta area sites. Over a few generations, those distinct building habits start to blur into hybrids, local styles absorbing and reworking the incoming ones. Foodways tell the same story. Plant remains from trash deposits show shifts in what people are eating and how. Maize is constant, but varieties and cob forms can change. You may see upticks in beans or squash, or in certain wild plants that were staples in one region, and only occasional foods in another. Grinding stones reflect changes in how grain is processed. Cooking jars suggest differences in preferred stews or porridges. None of these changes scream conquerors or replacement. They whisper neighbours, marriages, adoption, experimentation. Anthropologists sometimes talk about ethnogenesis, the process by which new peoples, new identities are formed out of older ones. In these aggregated pueblos, you can watch that happening in slow motion, layer by layer. Imagine being one of the newcomers. Your parents or grandparents left a cliff dwelling in the north. Maybe they stopped once or twice, planting temporary fields along the way, before finally settling near an existing village on the Rio Grande, or beside a spring in what's now Zuni country. At first, you occupy a marginal spot, maybe a new room block tacked onto the edge of the plaza, or a satellite hamlet a short walk away. You speak a dialect that marks you as from up there. Your pottery looks a bit odd to local eyes. Your ceremonies follow a calendar anchored to stars and landscape features back in the canyon country. To stay, you'll need allies. Some of those come through marriage. A daughter from your clan marries into a local household. A local young man comes to live among your people. Children in those unions grow up hearing both sets of stories, learning two sets of fields and shrines. Some alliances are forged ritually. Your group may be given or claim responsibility for a particular ceremony that the village needs: rain-calling, curing, initiation. Your sacred bundle, carried all that distance, now has a place in someone else's kiva. Their deities and yours may be equated, merged, or put into complementary roles. Over time, the sharp line between we who came from the north and we who were already here softens. A generation or two later, people may still remember ancestral origins in multiple directions. Some clans tracing roots to a mesa, others to a river confluence, others to a distant mountain. Listen to the way many modern Pueblo communities talk about their beginnings. At Hopi, at Zuni, in Keres and Tewa and Toa-speaking Pueblos, there are migration stories, often multiple, overlapping ones, about clans emerging from the underworld, then moving through a series of way stations, sometimes including recognizable places in the northern San Juan, Mesa Verde or Chaco regions. Groups split, wander, rejoin, are welcomed or turned away, finally settling in current villages only after long circuits. These oral histories do not read like tales of a people evaporating into thin air. They read like memories of movement, merger, and deliberate re-anchoring. In some accounts, groups that arrive are given land to plant and a place in the ceremonial cycle. In others, they must prove themselves, through ritual, work, or the demonstration of useful knowledge, before they are fully incorporated. Sometimes they keep their old clan names, sometimes they take new ones reflecting local geography or sacred narratives. From the perspective of descendant communities today, that late 1200s moment is not a catastrophe with a blank on the other side. It's a chapter in much longer migration traditions. The cliff dwellings and canyon pueblos are remembered not as lost ghost cities, but as earlier homes, stops along a mandated journey toward the places where people now live. Archaeology provides the material echoes of those memories. When you see a Rio Grande or Zuni area village where pottery styles from multiple regions converge, where kiva forms reflect several architectural lineages, where plant and animal remains suggest mixed subsistence strategies, you're seeing the physical residue of clans and households negotiating who they will be together. That negotiation plays out in identity. If you grew up in one of those big aggregated pueblos around 1300 or 1350, your sense of us might no longer map neatly onto any one ancestral place. Your grandparents' stories point in different directions. One line in your family remembers a canyon in Colorado. Another tells of a spring near what's now the Arizona-New Mexico border. A third speaks of always having been beside this river. Your language carries traces of all that mixing. Loan words, multiple terms for the same plant or ceremony, subtle shifts in pronunciation that mark clan origins. Your village dances combine motifs from several traditions, stitched into a new ceremonial calendar that fits the rhythms of this particular valley's seasons and soils. From the outside, centuries later, it's tempting to look at the mid-13th century abandonments and say, they vanished. From the inside, at the time, it may have felt more like, we became something else. What disappears in many northern canyons is a particular concentration of people in stone rooms under cliffs. What appears in the wake of that dispersal are new social formations, multi-origin pueblos that will, over time, develop distinct languages, distinct ritual systems, distinct names that we now recognize: Hopi, Zuni, Acoma, Taos, and many others. Even the built environment announces this shift. Cliff dwellings emphasize separation and defensibility, tucked high and tight into rock faces. The later aggregated pueblos, while often strategically placed, are fundamentally outward-facing. Big plazas, multi-story room blocks that front on open spaces, kivas embedded within the village rather than hidden away. These are architectures for large public ceremonies, for bringing people together who didn't grow up under the same overhanging cliff. So when we look at the timeline and see Mesa Verde's grand dwellings go quiet around 1280, and then, a few generations later, see the Rio Grande and other regions densely populated by large pueblos, the question shifts. It's not just, why did they leave? It's also, what did they become? Material evidence, oral tradition, and the lived continuity of descendant communities all push toward the same reframing. The people who built those cliff palaces did not simply stop existing. Their descendants are still there, in the languages spoken in modern pueblos, in the clan names recited in prayer, in the genetic and cultural threads that run through living communities. The overnight abandonment of northern cities begins to look less like a disappearance and more like a transformation. Messy, stressful, sometimes violent, but also creative. A redistribution of people across the landscape that allowed new kinds of social worlds to crystallize in places better suited to long-term survival under changing conditions. That reframing matters, because it changes what mystery we think we're trying to solve. Instead of hunting for a single killer cause that wiped out an entire people, we start asking how those people managed to reassemble themselves into enduring societies that could weather not just one drought cycle, but centuries of further change. And that brings us to the present debate, how scholars, archaeologists, and Pueblo voices today argue, not about whether the builders of the cliff cities vanished, but about how exactly their journeys, alliances, and transformations unfolded on the ground. If you go looking for the answer to why the cliff cities emptied out, you won't find one, you'll find camps. On one side are what you might call the climate-first people. They look at tree rings, lake cores, and cave deposits and see a brutally simple story. The late 1200s in much of the northern San Juan were dry, really dry, and not just for one or two bad seasons. Long, grinding drought, punctuated by a few partial recoveries, then more failure. The same proxies show that this wasn't the first time rainfall had dropped. But in the 1200s, the climate stress lined up with landscapes that had already been pushed hard by centuries of farming, wood cutting, and population growth. From this perspective, the abandonment is primarily an ecological event. Crops fail too often, springs weaken, forests cut for fuel and construction don't have time to regenerate. People move because the land they're on is no longer a good bet, and other places, riparian valleys, perennial rivers, basins with more reliable water, suddenly look much more attractive. Climate-first models don't say drought is the only factor, but they put it at the centre as the main driver that sets everything else in motion. Then there are the conflict-first arguments. These researchers look at the same period and see something more violent. They point to sites where human remains show clear signs of trauma, skull fractures, cut marks, dismemberment. They point to burned towers, smashed kivas, defensive walls thrown up across canyon mouths, villages perched on spires so precarious you wonder how anyone went up there without a death wish. They note that some of the most heavily fortified sites date right to the decades before broad abandonment. They see evidence of massacres, of groups wiped out, of settlements violently terminated rather than gently faded. From this angle, Drought is less the cause and more the accelerant. Scarcity intensifies competition. Raiding for food and captives becomes more attractive. Old tensions between communities flare. The safest strategy becomes not just to plant somewhere else, but to leave entire regions that have become too dangerous to occupy. A third line of thinking pushes back on both of those being first. Call it the social reorganization model. Here, the emphasis is on how people chose to respond to stress, not just on the stress itself. Proponents look at shifts in ritual architecture, changes in kiva forms, the building and abandonment of great houses, the appearance and disappearance of particular iconography on pottery and murals. They see evidence that belief systems, leadership structures and community identities were already in flux before the big droughts hit. They point out that some regions with similar climate conditions did not experience the same level of abandonment. They ask why some communities doubled down in place, rebuilding, reconfiguring, while their neighbours packed up and left. In this view, the key story isn't drought forced them out or violence drove them away, but people were renegotiating what it meant to be a community, and those renegotiations led some groups to dissolve, some to split, some to fuse with others, some to relocate as part of intentional restructuring. And then there's the position that's probably closest to how many archaeologists quietly think about it today. All of the above, and then some. Multi-causal models say, yes, climate matters. Yes, conflict matters. Yes, internal social reorganization matters. But none of those alone can account for the sheer complexity of what we see on the ground. A single canyon can hold sites that seem to end peacefully, with houses tidied up and valuables taken, sites that end in fire and scattered bones, sites that slowly thin over generations. Across the Four Corners region, abandonment is not a single event, but a patchwork of different endings over several decades, even a century. Multi-causal approaches insist that you can't pull one thread out and call it the explanation. Instead, you have to imagine layer on layer. Long-term environmental change, short-term drought spikes, soil exhaustion, timber depletion, spiritual dissatisfaction, factional politics, violence, marriage alliances, charismatic leaders calling for pilgrimage or withdrawal. Different combinations of those forces likely played out differently in different places, and that's where a lot of the real debate actually lives today. Not just in which factor matters most, but in where and when each factor tips the balance. Because the timeline is not uniform. In some parts of the Mesa Verde region, big cliff dwellings are abandoned by around 1280. But in other nearby drainages, smaller hamlets linger into the early 1300s. Some areas to the south see population increases even as the north is thinning. The Mogollon Rim, the Kayenta region, the Middle Little Colorado, the Western Rio Grande, all show slightly different arcs. That patchiness matters. If you argue that climate alone made living in the north impossible, you have to explain why some communities hung on longer than others under the same sky. If you argue conflict was decisive, you have to explain why some valleys with clear evidence of violence still retained dense populations for a time, while others emptied out more quickly. So some scholars drill down hard into local sequences, one canyon at a time, one drainage at a time, one cluster of villages that seem to share a common history. They map out in detail when each site was founded, when it grew, when it was remodeled, when it burned, when it was finally abandoned. They integrate tree ring dates with pottery styles, with architectural changes, with isotopic data from human bones and animal remains. They look for turning points, for signs of crisis or reorganization at the scale of individual communities. What emerges from that kind of work is a picture where general patterns, drought, aggregation, movement south, are real, but the way those patterns play out is intensely local. A drought in the late 1270s doesn't mean the same thing in a canyon with deep soils and reliable seeps as it does on a high mesa with shallow fields and distant water. A spike in raiding pressure doesn't land the same way in a heavily fortified, well-connected village as it does in a vulnerable hamlet at the margins of a polity. This is where historians and archaeologists start getting nervous about simple narratives. The story of "they vanished overnight when a drought hit" is appealing. It's clean. It feels intuitive. It lets us see the past as a single dramatic moment. But once you start laying precise dates and local details on the table, it falls apart. Not because drought didn't happen, it did. Not because people didn't experience fear and violence, many clearly did. But because those big forces interacted with 1,000 small particulars, the layout of a valley, the depth of a spring, the temperament of a ritual leader, the thickness of a forest, a marriage alliance that worked or failed. Strip those out, and you're left with a cartoon. That's one reason so much current research is focused on sharpening the context. New paleoclimate records now let archaeologists talk not just about a dry century, but about individual wet and dry years. Tree ring series from ancient timbers used in roofs can be matched to climate reconstructions, showing, for example, that a particular village expanded during a short run of good years, then was abandoned just after a cluster of terrible ones. Lake sediments and stalagmites from caves preserve chemical signatures of rainfall patterns. As methods improve, these records can be dated more precisely and tied to archaeological timelines with increasing confidence. That lets researchers say things like, when this site's population peaked, the regional climate was doing this, not just probably kind of dry. Isotope analysis adds another layer. The ratios of certain isotopes in human teeth and bones can reveal where someone grew up, what kinds of plants they ate, how much water stress they experienced. In some regions, this has shown that late in the 13th century, more and more people in a given village were born somewhere else, evidence of in-migration before final abandonment. Isotopes in animal bones and plant remains can indicate shifts in herd management, hunting territories, or field locations. Subtle changes in water sourcing or crop types can show up long before they are obvious in the architecture. Even ancient DNA, used carefully and with the consent and collaboration of descendant communities, is starting to play a role. In some cases, genetic data from ancient burials and from living Pueblo peoples can be compared, not to prove identity, which descendant communities do not need science to validate, but to explore patterns of relatedness, movement, and continuity across regions. Done right, these methods can confirm what oral histories have been saying for generations, that people moved, split, rejoined, intermarried, and carried their identities along winding paths rather than in straight lines. And yet, for all the new tools, there are limits that may never go away. We can measure that a house was abandoned between, say, 1277 and 1283. We can tell that its last occupants left with most of their valuables. We can see that a nearby site burned violently a few years later. We can infer that rainfall was low, that fields were stressed, that diets were changing. What we can't do is read the spoken conversations in those last winters. We don't know exactly what stories people told around their hearths when they debated leaving. We don't know who argued to stay, who urged migration, which ritual obligations they felt bound to honour, which prophecies they believed they were fulfilling by walking away from stone houses under cliffs. Archaeology is exquisitely good at some kinds of questions. When, where, what materials, how many? It is much weaker at why, in the sense of lived motives and meanings. Descendant communities fill in some of that with oral tradition, ceremony, and ongoing practice. But those sources are not simple transcripts of the 13th century. They are living, evolving narratives, shaped by everything that has happened since. Spanish invasion, missionization, forced schooling, land loss, resistance, survival. So scholars today work in attention. On one hand, they have more data than ever before, dense chronologies, fine-grained climate records, chemical signatures of movement and diet, comparative studies across entire regions. On the other hand, they are increasingly aware of how much of the story will always remain opaque, especially at the level of individual intention and emotion. Many would argue that this uncertainty is not a flaw to be engineered away, but part of what makes the story honest. If we pretend we can pin down a single cause, a single moment, a single explanation that covers every canyon and every village, we're not really talking about the past anymore. We're telling ourselves a fable, maybe a useful one, maybe a scary one, but a fable all the same. Acknowledging uncertainty allows other kinds of questions to surface. Not just why did they leave, but how did they manage to recreate viable communities elsewhere under such pressure? Not just what destroyed those cliff cities, but what choices did people make that allowed their descendants to be here today, telling the story from their own vantage point. In that sense, the debate is not just among scholars, it's between different ways of relating to the same set of traces. Stone walls, broken pots, tree rings, stories, songs. Some want the past to give them a clear warning about climate collapse or social breakdown. Others want it to confirm stories of resilience, migration, and ongoing presence. Most serious researchers, and many Pueblo voices, live somewhere in the complicated middle, where drought and conflict and belief and politics and luck all matter, and where no single logic is allowed to erase all the others. That's where the mystery still lives today. Not in the idea that people vanished. They didn't. But in the precise human-scale pathways by which thousands of individuals in hundreds of communities decided, over and over, to step away from old homes and towards something else. The traces of those decisions are what we read in Stone and Clay and Bone. The parts we can't see directly are what keep us asking. So where does that leave us? If you put all the pieces on the table, tree rings and tailless slopes, burned towers and carefully swept rooms, oral histories and isotopes, you end up with something like this. In the late 1200s, a lot of things went wrong at once. In a landscape where the margins were already thin, the climate leans dry, not as a single apocalyptic drought, but as a sequence of bad runs that keep coming back before fields and forests can really recover. Yields drop, springs grow fickle, people who have already shortened fallow cycles and cut younger and younger trees suddenly discover there is very little slack left. At the same time, those communities are not static. They've spent centuries building up big ceremonial centres, experimenting with new ritual forms, tying more and more households into regional networks of obligation, pilgrimage, and trade. That brings strength and stress. Not everyone benefits equally. Some communities start to feel like they're carrying more weight than they're getting back. Overlay scarcity on top of that, and the politics get sharper. Old alliances strain. Raiding that might once have been episodic becomes more tempting as a strategy. Some villages fortify, building walls and towers and moving to hard-to-reach ledges. Others respond not with more defence, but by leaning harder into ceremony, trying to rebalance the world through ritual. And then, within that big pattern, the small specifics start to matter a lot. If you live in a canyon with deep soils, a reliable seep, and good connections to distant partners, you might be able to ride out a bad decade by tightening belts, shifting fields, bringing in food from relatives 2 valleys away, taking in refugees and weaving them into your community. If you're on a high, exposed mesa with thin soil and long walks to water, the same sequence of dry years may hit like a hammer. You might look around and realize that even if the rains return, the forest is stripped, the soil tired, the old balance between people and land broken in ways that won't heal in your children's lifetimes. At that point, why leave flips into why stay. Not just in a practical sense, though practicality weighs heavily when your kids are hungry and your woodpile is small, but in a spiritual and social one. If your cosmology tells you that balance has been lost, that obligations elsewhere are calling, that migration is part of how people restore right relations with the world, then staying put in a failing landscape may feel not just risky, but wrong. So the most plausible story is not a single cause, but a convergence. Environmental stress tightens the screws. Social and religious systems already in motion channel that stress into particular responses. Some of those responses are violent, some are peaceful, some are experimental. New villages, new ritual spaces in new places. All of them are choices made by people who inherited stone cities they had every reason to love. And that, emotionally, is the part that can be hardest to wrap your head around. Because these weren't just houses. These were places layered with grandparents and great-grandparents, with songs about where to place each beam, with origin stories painted on kiva walls. People had buried their dead beneath those floors, raised their children in those courtyards, watched the sun track across those cliff faces for decades. Walking away from that is not a minor decision. It's not just the crops failed, time to move. It's leaving behind the visible proof that your ancestors did something extraordinary. They turned vertical sandstone into architecture and community. To go anyway, to step out onto those roads south and east, suggest a fierce clarity. Either the place can no longer sustain you, or the meaning of being your people has shifted in a way that demands movement, or most likely both at once. That's one of the quiet lessons the empty rooms still carry. From a distance they can look like failure, walls without roofs, kivas open to the rain, tumbled stones sliding down the talus. It's easy to read that as collapse. But if you get close enough, if you pay attention to what's gone as well as what's left, you start to see something else. You see that most valuables were taken, grinding stones removed, portable ritual objects carried away, roof beams in some cases pried out and reused elsewhere. You see rooms that were cleaned up rather than wrecked, hearths raked out, doorways sealed. You see that people didn't just die there, they departed. And when you follow the trails forward in time, to pueblos along the Rio Grande, the Zuni and Hopi mesas, the many other communities across the southwest that trace their histories through these migrations, you see that what looked like an ending from one vantage point is a beginning from another. The cliff cities, in that sense, teach a kind of resilience that doesn't always match our modern fantasies. We like stories where success means holding on, staying in the same house, the same city, the same way of life, no matter what. The ancestral Pueblo story suggests that sometimes resilience looks like knowing when to walk, and having the social and spiritual tools to build life again somewhere else without losing who you are. They adapted not just by tweaking farming practices, but by reweaving entire landscapes of belonging. They carried ceremonies, kinship systems, and names across hundreds of miles. They turned departure into continuity. That's the mystery that still breathes in those canyons today. Not where did they go? Descendant communities have been answering that in their own ways all along. But what did it feel like to be the people who made that call? We will never know every detail of those conversations, but we can stand in the echo of them and let them sharpen questions about our own world. What are we willing to leave behind? What do we insist on carrying forward? How do we tell when a place has moved from home to hazard, and what stories make it possible to move without erasing ourselves? I'd love to hear how you read this story. When you look at those stone cities, at least in your mind's eye, what do you think tipped the balance? Was it the sky, the soil, the sword, the stories, or some mix that we haven't quite named yet? Share your theories in the comments and try to keep it respectful. Remember that for many people today, this isn't just ancient mystery content. It's family history, living tradition. If you want to go deeper into this kind of deep time detective work, how we piece together prehistoric lives from tiny traces, I've put a lot more in my book about prehistoric secrets and the hidden hinges of human history. You can read more about it and pick up a copy if you'd like at sleepytimehistory.com. And if you found this exploration thought-provoking, it really helps the channel if you like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Drop a comment to tell me where you're listening from. I'm always fascinated by the journeys these stories take, from a 13th century canyon to wherever you are right now. Thanks for being here, and for letting this old mystery breathe a little in your imagination.